Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
1. I have never been a superstitious man, and can honestly say that I do not believe in vampires, ghouls, demons, or anything else that those youngsters with their vivid imaginations and smartphones like to dream up. But there is one thing that happened a very long time ago that still haunts me to this day. I do not know whether I dreamt the whole thing or not, and it has plagued me for 70 long years. Memories are a funny thing, and I admit they are subject to mythologizing. As we grow old, our childhood recollections betray us. They blur and fade, and often all we are left with are these fragmented shards of the original events. But this memory is as clear as the morning sun to me. What I'm about to tell you, I have never told anyone before. It is up to whoever reads this whether you believe me or not. Every time I close my eyes, I see his horrifying visage clearer and clearer, looming up out of the depths of my mind like some grotesque phantom. His pale face perched there in the gloom of that forest still sends icy shivers down my neck. I am an old man now and probably only have a few more years left here. The eternal darkness of the afterlife is all that awaits me, and I think it would be some form of sin to leave this earth without at least telling people what I saw and what I did. It all happened in Dartmoor, England. It was 1948. I was a young lad then, 10 years old. I grew up in a small town called Princetown. It was the only town right in the center of over 300 square miles of nothing but wild, open moorlands and deep river valleys. Dartmoor was always an eerie and isolated place. I knew this even when I was a boy. It was a place where the secrets of nature were still unknown to the residents, and everything beyond the town seemed to be shrouded in a kind of permanent mist. Generations of our family had lived and died right there in Princetown, most of them never even leaving the county lines. And the last of our family line was only me, my mother, younger brother, and father, living in a small white rundown cottage about 4 miles down from Princetown. Let me tell you, Dartmoor did not look like it does now. Back then, it was even more rugged and barren. There were few paved roads, and most houses in the town were nothing more than bleak, moldering terrace houses, squatting there in the perpetual bog. Slates roofs and old masonry walls with small square windows on each face. Rows of them sheltering quiet, hard-working families who'd huddle around their wood stoves together at night. During the day, curtains would twitch, and you could sometimes catch glimpses of the solitary hermits who had been living there for decades. The town only really existed because of the prison that was built up there on the damp rolling moors sometime back in the 17th century. And even then, the prison itself was ironically only built there because it would have been harder for the prisoners to escape. Princetown was like some lonely bastion or frontier town set up high in the hills. Most of Dartmoor around it was deep pine woods and marshland, long dark places filled with deer and other things that crept around nervously in the trees. This was before pylons carved their way across the lands, and those great metal eagles were seldom seen in the skies. Before most of the forests were cut down by the Forestry Commission, there was a lot of room for secrets. One of them I met. My dad was a prison warden at HMP Dartmoor. He would work 15-hour shifts, and I rarely saw him, if I'm honest. So for the majority of my childhood, it was just me and my mother. She worked at the Plume of Feathers pub there in Princetown. She was a barmaid, and every night she would put me to sleep at 7 before heading off to work. I spent a lot of time on my own, and as a result, had to entertain myself. I would often play with my little wooden trucks down in the meadows at the back of our house. And when both parents were working, I'd stay up by candlelight and read dictionaries and encyclopedias. I was quite a dull kid, if I'm being honest. If my wife were still alive now, she would tell you I have never had an imagination and am one of the least creative people you would ever meet. Anyway, I'd just turned 10 and was getting used to the idea of being an only child. But then, Elfie was born. Little Elfie. He was such a sweet baby. One day my mother came into my bedroom and sat me on the bed. She took my hand, told me I would have a baby brother soon. I hugged her and she told me nothing would change and I would still be her eldest son. At first, I was excited at the prospect of having someone to play with and someone to look after. But after he was born, things changed. I couldn't help but notice how much they doted on him. It felt like I was unceremoniously pushed aside. It began to burn inside me. That idle neglection soon gave way to jealousy. I didn't know why, but I started to dislike Elfie. Whenever he would giggle and kick his little legs, I would roll my eyes and leave the room. Not that my mom or my dad would notice me leave. They were too enamored with how cute Elfie was to take interest in me anyway. To this day, I do not know why I let it happen. The logical reason would have been a fit of deep jealousy, but I know that's not what I was thinking at the time. To tell you the truth, I wasn't really thinking at all. It was early evening, a sultry hot evening in July. I was giving my mother a hand with bathing Elfie. I would pass her the soap and such as she gently bathed and scrubbed giggling little Elfie. His head was half submerged in the water, and he looked up at me and her and smiled. He had bright blue eyes and wispy blonde hair. A cheeky rounded face framed his fat little grin. Babies have spent most of their lives in liquid, so it was no surprise why he was so happy and comfortable bobbing there in the warm soapy water. He must have thought he was back in our mom's womb all over again. I didn't know why his smile bothered me so much. Maybe I saw it as a smirk and that he knew what he was doing. I thought he was mocking me. At one point, my mother mentioned that she had to get ready for work. She stood up and asked me to hold on to Elfie for a few minutes while she brushed her hair. So I did. I put my arm down and held the back of his head gently. His piercing aqua blue eyes looked right into me. He waved his arms excitedly and chuckled, spewing water from his mouth as he did. He was such a sweet baby. It was then that I decided I needed to get a towel to dry him off. My mother didn't have long before she had to leave for work, and we had to dry him down before putting him to bed. So I sat him upright in the bath and left the room. Then, without thinking, I went and sat on the end of my bed and waited. I don't know why I did that. A few minutes later, I heard my mother's screaming echo down the hallway, this agonizing weeping that made me shudder. "No!" she bellowed. "Elfie, no, God, no!" She screamed that over and over. She then burst into my room holding Elfie. He was no longer giggling. His pale, lifeless body hung from her grip like he was a wet towel. "What did you do?" she screeched at me. "What did you do?" I couldn't say anything. There was a thick, squelching lump in my throat, stopping me from talking, and I couldn't even look at her. My skin tingled and I felt sick. All I was thinking was, "Liam, why did you do that? Why did you let him drown?" My mom cried and sobbed. She hugged his body tight to hers, tears streaming down her red face. She then closed her eyes and went quiet. And so did I. It was worse when my dad came back. The police and the ambulance came with him. Elfie was pronounced dead at the scene. The police interrogated me while my mom sobbed into my dad's arms in the background. The detective asked what I did, and I could only reply, "I went to get a towel for him. I'm sorry." When the police left, my dad beat me. I didn't even try stopping him. I knew I deserved it. That night destroyed my family. A month later, my father left us. He didn't say anything to me before he did. 2. All of that happened 6 years before I met the thing in the trees. The year was 1954. After Elfie died and my father had left, it was just me and my mother in that lonely, decaying cottage together. My mom had fallen into the bottle and only acknowledged me when she needed me to do the chores or fetch her more booze. I had noticed in that time she was staying late after her shifts, seeing men, and she had begun to look ill. Her skin was sickly and sallow, and her eyes always gray and sunken. My mother was always a pretty woman, and it was hard to watch her slow descent, knowing I had caused it all. It was late one night in January, and I was about to go to bed when I heard the familiar slurring demands echoing from down the hall after me. "Boy," she crowed. Since Elfie's death, she refused to call me by my Christian name. "Go to the general store and get me the big bottle of brandy they have. If you leave now, you still make it." I had no choice but to oblige. If I didn't get her what she asked for, then she would have no doubt thrown me out onto the damp, squalid streets. I don't need to tell you how well a boy of 16 would have fared back then. So I rose from my bed, changed into my winter gear, and put on my blue parka coat that I had outgrown 2 years previously. I came into what was our living room, and she was there, lying across the only sofa in a decrepit heap of drunkenness, clumps of mold accumulating in the corners of the room around her. The radio crackled in the background, playing some old-timey tune that I can't recall now. From the crumpled sofa, she tossed me some tattered notes and told me to hurry up. She was already half asleep at this point, so I was unsure why she needed any more booze. I picked it up all the same, and I left. I shut the door behind me and headed out into the freezing night. It was bitterly cold, and my breaths came out in thick white plumes that rose up and vanished into the vacuous black sky. I stood there on our porch, the dull amber lamp above twitching nervously, and I thought briefly about what I should do. It was a 4-mile walk to Princetown if I followed the main road, but a 2-mile walk if I took a shortcut through the forest that ran adjacent to it. I don't know why I decided to cut through the forest that night. I guess in my mind I just wanted to get it over with so I could go to sleep sooner. I was already employed at Plymouth Docks as a laborer and had to cycle 10 miles to the yard every day. Walking 8 miles at almost 10 o'clock at night was not the type of rest I needed, so I went with the latter. After all, I had played in that forest when I was 10 years old. I had walked through it during the day multiple times, and I guess I felt pretty confident that I could navigate it just as competently in the dead of night. With a plan in mind, I set off and headed for the woods. I could barely see it in the distance, but I knew it was there. I knew you could get to Princetown quicker from our house by way of that thin and muddy pathway that cut across a field and eventually a part of the pine forest called Wistman's Wood. But it would be much harder at night. Foolishly, that was what I decided to do. It was a gloomy copse of stunted moss-covered pedunculate oak trees shrouding the epiphytic undergrowth and boggy rock-strewn floor. After a short walk down the muddy path, I came to it. The stretch of woods was supposedly haunted. A few centuries back, there were rumors of witch trials in there. Pagans, Celtic shamans, and other heretics used to flock and conduct ceremonies at night when the moon was swollen and gibbous. People and farm animals alike had gone missing over the years, and if you could go there today, you can still see the strange, archaic ruins carved into the lichen-covered boulders that sit scattered in the gnarled and ancient oakwood forest. But that wasn't why people today still say it is haunted. There was something else in there, Of course, at the time I had heard of the old folk tale of the thing in the trees, but I took no notice of it. The aspects of the story seemed just so juvenile to me that I dismissed the whole thing as some old camper's tale told around the bonfire to warm their cockles. With a wry shrug of the shoulders, I headed into the trees. The sooner I got through it, the sooner I could get back. The trees started low to the ground on the outskirts. I had to duck under a few of the branches to make any kind of headway. It was a dark night anyway, but once I stepped into the woods, I realized just how dark things could get. I could barely see 5 feet in front of my face, resigning myself instead to feeling and pushing through the damp mossy branches that scraped across my cheeks. It must have been about 40 minutes when I made it through the fabled Wistman's Wood and then into the deep brooding pine forest behind it. At this point, I began to feel scared. The walk was taking too long. I'd begun to lose my sense of direction. The trees were tall and looming above me, and everything was deathly silent in there. Not even the owls were howling. It was as if the woodland critters were too terrified to make their presence known. But that wasn't what was scaring me. Instead, it felt like there was something watching me. I didn't know how to explain it, but I felt this hungry, hot stare on my back. But every time I turned to try and see what it was, there was nothing there. Just the rows of silent trees. An impenetrable wall of black seemed to surround me and creep in closer when I wasn't looking. It must have been another hour when I finally realized I didn't know which direction I was heading in anymore. I tried to spot the faint amber lights of Princetown glowing in the distance, but I couldn't see a thing. I didn't hear anything either. Just the same unrelenting, heaving darkness of the never-ending forest. Still, there was this presence near me. It was like a shadow was walking too close behind me. When I'd passed the 2-hour mark was when I began to fear for my life. I quietly wondered whether I'd ever find my way out again. If I didn't, would my mother even notice? Would anyone come looking for me? In a panic, I called out, "Hello, is anyone there? I'm lost." Nothing. Not a sound. The branches on the trees weren't even swaying. Everything was deathly still and unnervingly silent. I was truly lost and alone. I continued walking for what felt like days. My stomach was rumbling and my legs began to ache with the constant timid stepping over the rocks and fallen trees. At one point, I leaned against a tree and buried my head in my forearm, thinking hard about what I should do. I'd called out a few more times, but still heard nothing back. The nighttime air was freezing my joints and making my exposed skin go numb. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine myself in front of a warming fire or wrapped up back in my bedsheets. Then, as I dreamed of roaring stove fires and comfy sofas, I heard something come from behind me. "Liam, Princetown is this way," it whispered softly. My eyes bulged open and I darted around to face it. Numbing fear gripped me, but when I peered back into the darkness, there was nothing. "Hello? Is someone there?" I asked quietly, trying not to sound scared. Was the tale true after all? I thought. Then coming from my right side now, "You have to hurry, or Mommy will throw you away." The voice sounded like nothing I had ever heard before. It was hoarse and guttural, but also had a bizarre echoing timbre to it. "Hello?" I shouted this time. "Please, I'm lost and I'm cold." "Not as cold as Elfie," the strange metallic voice chuckled from between the branches. I shuddered and looked around. My first thought was, how the hell do they know about my baby brother? "Who's that out there?" I begged. My voice was trembling. Then I heard something emanating through the trees that made my skin run cold. Slowly, rising out of the ruddy darkness of the forest, I heard a baby crying. A feeble wailing that only babies can do. It cried and cried, the noise of it all rising into a crescendo around me. I looked up and tried to pinpoint where exactly the sound was coming from, but it was too hard to tell. "Please, sir, I need to get out of here," I said. After a few moments of the baby crying, I heard that horrible alien voice once more. "Follow the baby, and you will get out." So I did. The noise of the cry distilled and focused in one direction. I started chasing after it. As I climbed over the dead decaying branches and through the cold leaves, I thought of Elfie again. How did this person know about Elfie? I wondered. As I moved deeper into the woods, I began to hear another sound. It was unmistakable to me, a sound impossible to forget. I heard my mother's agonizing wails the night Elfie died. That sound was etched into my mind forever, and I heard it all over again in the center of the long dark woods that I couldn't escape. Without warning, I began to howl. The noises of baby Elfie crying and my mother keening assailed my ears and made me break down. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry," I shouted in reply, but they continued crying and sobbing in the blackness. "Please, Mom, I didn't mean to. I'm sorry." They didn't stop, so I wiped the tears from my blistered face and continued walking. I didn't know what direction I was heading in, but at that point, it didn't seem to matter anymore. 3. For what felt like days, I continued wandering around in the darkness, all of it an endlessly repeating cycle of tree trunks and gulches, hills and moss-covered stones. I was so sick of it all. I was so tired that I couldn't even lift my head to glance forward at my plight. Instead, just this relentless stream of moss and puddles drifted below my feet. The air was raw and wretched against my skin. The icy clasp of death seemed to be clawing its way under my coat now. I was beyond cold. The ghosts of my past crying had subsided. I only heard them faintly in the distance now. I continued walking. I walked and walked. Then my feet began to slow and drag across the primal earth. I began to stumble. Soon I wasn't walking anywhere. I remember this part clearest of all. I then conceded defeat and sat down at the base of a giant ancient pine tree and just stared off into the inky darkness, almost accepting my fate now. I sighed and leant back. The bark of the tree scraped against my legs and back, and the earth below me was much colder than the air, but I didn't care anymore. I thought I was going to die in there. In a strange and morbid kind of way, I felt like I had deserved it. The moldering earth decaying and absorbing me until not even my bones remained. The memory of what I had done, no more. The night drew on and I felt my extremities slowly fade into absence. The frost and air made everything retreat into numbness, and with the chilling embrace of the night, my young mind began to leave me too. I couldn't think straight. I sat there in the dirt and stared ahead into the abyss of the primordial forest. All those trees bearing down upon me, reaching out to embrace me as one of their own. And there, just as I began lulling in and out of consciousness, I saw something ahead of me. Against the flat darkness, an almost imperceptible shape lingered. I squinted at first, unsure of what I was looking at. Then I blinked slowly and tried to focus on it. The frost on my eyelashes stung like bee stings, and everything in my body was shutting down. But still, I saw something there. It was a tall and pale figure there amidst the knee-high grass and lichens. It was looking right at me, but it didn't look with eyes. I felt its gaze. It took on the form of a person, but it couldn't have been. It was too tall, at least 7 feet, It was wearing a long dark robe, like a Jesuit priest, draped over its emaciated body. It was hard to tell, but I thought I saw 4 arms crawling and scrabbling around under its shroud. The thing had no face. Instead, just this rounded surface, like the shell of a rotten egg. Around the jowls of the face was drooping pallid skin that looked like drained chicken fillets. There were no eyes, no features, except a thin black slit running down the center of its skull. I was gripped in a kind of dull paralysis and my heart thundered in my ribcage. I stared forward at it, poised against the bracken and pine needles. As I look back now, I believe it was Death himself that I met that night. I believe he came to take me, but it was not my time, it seemed. I was so enervated of strength that I could not hold my eyes open any longer. Everything faded. The thing came towards me, looming up out of the lightlessness of this horrible night. It didn't walk. It had no feet. It came gliding at me, hovering just off the ground. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I couldn't move anything. Unconscious fear became an unassailable reality. As it drew nearer, I realized my body was shutting down. Then I sunk down into something abyssal. I felt the world falling away from me. In the deepest pit of blackness, I had only a vague awareness of my utter terror. But death never came for me. Something else did. 4. Sometime later, I awoke in a daze and felt curiously warm somehow. My thoughts were fuzzy and I couldn't focus properly. Surely, slowly, my eyes blinked open for the first time in a long time, and I looked around. It wasn't the forest anymore. I was somewhere else now. As my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw that I was on my back, laying on a sofa of sorts. There was a thick sheep's wool blanket draped over me, and I couldn't move any of my arms or legs. I was inside now. The room I was in was glowing with warmth. Candles twinkled on the windowsills, and the floor was made from this thick oak that seemed to absorb the light from them. In the corner of the room, crackling away, was a roaring stove fire. The flames rolled and danced over the logs in the peripheries of my sight. It was all a miasma of heat and scents. It smelt like matches and copper in there. I tried to rise from the bed but stopped myself when I noticed a huge figure sitting on a stool by the fire before me. Is that him? The thing in the trees? I thought. The shadow of its bulk cast across the floor towards me. Fear gripped me once more, and I didn't make a sound that would alert it to my awakeness. I laid there, looking across at it, unmoving, unsure of what to do. It had those same dark robes that draped over its immense stature. The thing looked like a grizzly bear hunched over in a duvet. It had its back to me, and at regular intervals I observed the thick tobacco-smelling wafts rising from its hood. "No need to pretend," the figure said in a warm, mellow voice. "I know you're with us now." "Where am I?" I asked after a long, hushed pause. "Where you always wanted to be." "Where's that?" It never looked at me. It just stared into the flames of the wood burner and sucked away sullenly on its pipe. After a drawn-out silence, it craned ever so slightly towards me and said, "You have carried something for a long time. What is it?" I saw no point in lying anymore. I knew what he was talking about. If it were the same thing from between the trees, and I believe it was, then he already knew about Elfie, about what I did. So after a teary gulp, I spoke. "I did something very bad," I muttered. "What?" it asked with a shrewd air of wisdom. I shook my head and stared into the threnody of flames burning up all the wood and coal. "I let my brother drown," I said. "He was only 6 months old. I don't know why I did that. I didn't dislike him. I actually—" The thing cocked its head to the right and blew out a big cloud of acrid smoke. "How?" "He was in the bath. I was supposed to be keeping an eye on him, but... And what did you do? I bit my tongue hard before speaking. Then, I left the bathroom. I left him, I said as I felt my voice grow tight. Then what? I let him drown. It was hard to tell, but it looked like the thing sat in front of the fire had nodded in acknowledgement. What do you feel? It said earnestly. My skin tingled and I felt my face well up with tears. They poured out like two scarring waterfalls from my eyes. Just want my brother back. Even if that means that you die? Yes, I don't care. I just want him back. I want to tell him I'm sorry. I never wanted him gone. Yes, I didn't want to be overlooked. Then there was quiet in the room. The fire rolled away and everything was silent once more. The thing by the fire bowed its head. You look very tired, little boy. You should close your eyes, it said. After a long pause, I asked, Who are you? We knew each other once, although we never truly got to know each other. Close your eyes. Sleep. I had wanted to ask him more, but as soon as he said that sentence, it was like being given a warm cup of milk. My eyes drooped and my body relaxed. My eyes shut and I felt the most comfortable I have ever been. I soon fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. Thoughts and dreams rolled over me like waves on an eternal beach. 5. I woke up with sunlight in my eyes, slanting its way through the trees and onto my face. As I opened them slowly, its blinding glare filtered into my vision, and I found myself awake once more. My head pounded and I felt vaguely nauseous, but I was alive. I rubbed my furrowed brows in confusion and tried to coax the sleep from my eyes. When I leaned up wearily and looked around, I saw that I was still in the dreaded forest. But it was different now. It was the morning. My sight adjusted to the bitter sun rays and I could see the edge of the forest. In fact, I was a mere 10 feet away from the main road that led into Princetown. The relief shot through me, and I almost started crying again. More than anything, I was just glad to see the end and be free of the awful trees. Frost sparkled on all the grass, and the brisk morning breeze was cool and refreshing against my skin. I got up, dusted the dried and gray mud off myself, and then headed into town. My thoughts were racing. Did I imagine all that? Or did that thing bring me to the edge of the forest? I imagined every conceivable possibility on that walk back into Princetown. When I made it into town, I could see a small congregation of people standing around the town hall. They all looked worried and concerned as they glanced across at each other. Some had the collars of their coats rolled up to shield against the cold winds. One of them turned and spotted me, then said, "He's here." All of them turned to face me and then came rushing towards me. My mother was there with them. She burst into tears when she saw me. She hugged me and said she was sorry. I said I was sorry too. After that, they took me to Plymouth Hospital to make sure I was all right. And I was. Yet I didn't know how exactly. To this day, I cannot say for certain just what happened. All I know is I felt it. I felt like I had met death that night in the dim forest. And if you feel it, then it must be real. That's all I have to say about that. You may make up your own mind whether I'm just a bored old boy trying to pull a fast one on everyone, or if I really did meet death that night long ago. Anyway, we'll leave it there. I'm tired now, and I'm waiting for my carer to bring me my afternoon hot chocolate before I have my nap. I can't stay up late anymore like all them youngsters. You'll understand one day when you're my age. You know, as I have written this, more and more has come back to me. I don't think dying is such a bad thing after all. As I become more senile and infirmity creeps ever closer, I must confess, I am sad to see all of this end. But I'm also optimistic for what lies on the other side of death. I hope Elfie is there. I hope he forgives me.
Let me ask you something. Do you feel like a failure? Do you feel like you're nothing but a walking sack of flaws held by a sack of meat? Do you wish you could change it? If so, how would you do it? Would you try changing your dietary habits? Eat less junk food, eat more veggies, etc.? Maybe try exercising more or hitting the gym 3 times a week, right? Maybe you'll finally ask out that super hot coworker that has you tongue-tied every time you try to talk to her. Oh, I know. You'll try turning to faith to seek out some higher form of encouragement now, won't you? Let me guess, though. You've tried most, if not all, of the aforementioned methods, haven't you? You've done what the hippies and the shrinks have spouted at you, and you still feel like you have no place in this God-forsaken world. Right? I'll bet you'd sell your soul just to feel like you mean something in this life, wouldn't you? I bet you wish you could be perfect. What if you could be? Now, before you accuse me of blowing smoke, hear me out. Yes, there is a way for you and I, human beings, to be perfect. Just imagine it for a second. You could live for the rest of your life without flaws. No, you'd live unable to create flaws. You'd never make any mistakes. You'd never hurt anybody. You'd always be able to finish what you start, and best of all, you will never fail at anything again. Sounds great, right? I'll bet it sounds too good to be true to you, doesn't it? I can practically hear your next words coming a mile away. How in the hell am I supposed to make myself perfect? Well, if you really are that desperate to know, I can tell you how. Don't ask me right now how I know about what I'm about to tell you. I'll get to that later. In all honesty, it's all something I, myself, am still trying to comprehend. For now, if you're still serious about this, here's how to begin. A quick history lesson on this is that the game, or ritual itself, is called the Ritual of the Damned Lamb. It was apparently used by various lesser-known, unnamed, and underground religious societies and or cults in older times, usually as a way of ascension, or for seeking some divine forgiveness for trespassing in some way to the faith. Only very, very, very few individuals today from those faiths are still around, and would still use this practice today. I say all of this to say that there's essentially a prerequisite for attempting this. You have to believe in something. It doesn't have to be Christianity, obviously, given that the religions that practice this weren't exactly what most would consider to be Christians themselves. You could be Christian, Catholic, Buddhist, Muslim, Wiccan, or even some made-up religious belief like Heaven's Gate, just as long as you believe in the existence of some higher power. You're set to begin this practice. Now here's what you'll need. Sticks or twigs. An empty room, or at least a length and width of 6 to 8 feet of open floor space. A blade or object sharp enough to draw blood. A blindfold of some sort. To begin, take the sticks or twigs you've gathered and place them into your empty space, forming them into the shape of whatever symbol or talisman represents your personal faith or beliefs. You'll need to make the symbol large enough to lie down on top of, so the number of sticks will vary according to the shape and size of the symbol. Next, remove all clothing, and, using your sharp object, Pierce the palms of your hands and smear your blood at the point where your hands, head, and feet would be. Now, lie down inside the shape of your symbol and put on your blindfold. Make sure your blindfold is on tight, painfully tight if you need to. You should be able to see nothing but complete darkness throughout for this to work. Lastly, take your sharp object and carve an X into the center of your chest and whisper, "In the names of those that stand beyond our veil, I offer unto thee my blood, my flesh, and my mind for sale. Take it, for I am thy damned lamb, and grant me perfection that I may never again fail." Now, lay calmly and still inside your symbol. Good. Eventually, you'll start to feel a stinging sensation, like you're being poked with a bunch of hot needles or shards of glass in your chest. Keep calm. Lie still. Trust me, movement will only make it hurt worse. You should start hearing multiple faint whispers circling simultaneously around in your mind. They'll each be in a different language and different tones. Some will just whisper, like it's trying to tell you a secret, while others will scream to you, like they're in pain. Again, stay calm and try to listen to each word being said. You should start to hear the words form together to create a jumbled, distorted mess of words, yet you will somehow be able to comprehend it in your own language. What exactly is said may vary, but essentially, it should be something to the effect of, "I have come, my child. What doth thou seek?" To this, you must answer one word: perfection. Now you should start to feel the stabbing sensation in your hands and feet as well. Again, stay calm and still. The voice will ask your name, your age, sex, date of birth, and finally, what it is that you believe in. Answer the questions clearly and honestly. It will know if you're lying. And it will make this whole thing that much more painful for you. Now, here's where your endurance is tested. The voice will then proceed to describe moments of your life where you exhibited some imperfection or flaw. It will be described in great detail to you, essentially forcing you to relive the moment yourself. At first, it'll be something small, minute, something you'd normally pass off, like the little white lies you used to tell your mom and dad to try and get out of trouble, or maybe even the time you got away with sneaking off with the dollar store candy bar. Over time, however, it will start to detail more and more personal flaws or embarrassments in your life, the ones you've tried to keep secret, as well as even the ones you've managed to repress. It will then ask you to either confess or deny what was said. Whatever it is, like before, answer truthfully. For each confession, the pain in your hands, feet, and chest will gradually become worse, eventually becoming almost unbearable. Remain calm and still and continue to answer honestly. Eventually, the described moments will have caught up to the present, and it will then ask you if you wish to be made perfect. Should you answer no, well, I can't say what would happen. Now, here's where I answer your question from before about how I know all of this. It was about a year ago to the day now that I performed this ritual. I was looking at my final days on death row, the needle waiting for me. I won't go into detail on what all I'd done, or should I say what all didn't I do, to land me there. Suffice to say, I was a very bad man who's destroyed, in many different ways, the lives of good people. And I'll be the first to tell you that I deserved every bit of what was waiting for me. That was the day I was to be visited by a priest for last confessions. By that point, I'd already been long past the state of mind or heart to care about clearing my conscience. I'd already confessed to everything in the courtroom. What good was it going to do me to repeat myself to some random pious moron now? The way I saw it, my place in hell was booked and reserved, and nothing was going to change that. I remember when he first walked up to my cell. He was a middle-aged man wearing a black trench coat and hat like he was the exorcist or something, and his face was pale and gaunt. To tell the truth, I almost thought I'd finally lost my mind, and I was now seeing ghosts or something when I saw him at first. For a while, he just stared at me with the coldest, deadest eyes I'd ever seen outside of a Vietnam vet. "Well?" I said, annoyed. "Either spout your scriptures or shove off. I've already confessed everything, and I'm screwed no matter what I say or do now, so unless the miracle you're about to run your mouth about is that you're holding a pardon for the governor, please, just spare me." He just continued staring daggers at me, and I was tempted to do something to cause a disruption just to make him leave. "I'm here," he said, in a cracked yet baritone voice, "to offer you salvation, Mr. Keller." I looked at him again like he was insane before chuckling dryly. Despite this, he just kept on staring at me. "You serious?" I asked in disbelief. "Salvation? What do you think you're going to get me? To give my heart to Jesus or some shit like that?" Look, I stopped buying into all that crap long ago. Trust me, there is no saving my soul. He stood motionless and silent. I could see from the look on his face that, in his mind at least, he wasn't kidding about whatever he was talking about. That said, what the hell was that supposed to mean? Offering me salvation? He took a deep breath and spoke again. Perhaps I should rephrase. "I'm here, Mr. Keller, to offer you the opportunity for perfection." Now, I really was confused. Huh? What are you talking about now? A chance at perfection? What's that supposed to mean? He was silent again. "Well?" I urged, quickly feeling my patience leave me. "Exactly what I said, Mr. Keller. I'm here to offer you a chance at becoming perfect. No more pain. No more flaws. None of the wickedness in your heart. You should never do any wrong again." I was lost for words. Normally, by this point, I'd have either stopped listening and ignored them until they went away, or I'd have told them exactly where they could cram it and made them leave. This time, though, something was different. For one thing, he said all of this with the most dire conviction. In most cases, I can tell when they're trying to just spout their usual jabber out at me about the gospel, but this wasn't that, though. After all, he clarified that he was offering me perfection instead of the Lord's mercy or some shit like that. Despite this, that still didn't completely convince me that this was legit. What does he mean by becoming perfect? What are you? Allow me to enter, and I can show you what I'm talking about. Now, I was convinced this guy popped a few screws loose. Right. Let you in my cell. Like they'd even allow that. Oh, you're funny, pal. He sighed and looked down before saying he'd be back again tomorrow. Use the time you have left wisely, Mr. Keller, was the last thing he said to me before turning and leaving the block, sauntering down the hallway like some supervillain in a movie. That night, I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning, wondering who in the name of God this crackpot was and what he was going on about. And sure enough, like clockwork, come 10 a.m. the next morning, there he was, approaching my cell in that same menacing fashion he did the previous day with a duffel bag. I was caught off guard, however, when I saw two of the guards then unlock and open the cell door, letting him in. Before I could ask if the guards themselves had lost their damn minds, he held up his hand, silencing me, and said, "Just listen to me." Without any real way to argue or protest, I scoffed and gestured him to come on in. He then went on to tell me about the ritual of the damned lamb, how to perform it, and the different groups that performed it for divination and all that, as I said earlier. While he railed on, he started pulling out the aforementioned materials out of his bag. The sticks, the blade, and the blindfold. I was instantly in shock, seeing the knife. How in the hell did he manage to get that past the front, I wondered. Well, probably the same way he managed to convince them to even let him into my cell at all. In any case, he then asks me if I was ready to perform the ritual, to become perfect, to quote his words. Now I was the silent one. Has anyone ever even accomplished this? Well, I can't say for certain. Only they themselves would know. And where exactly are they now? I was not feeling good about any of this. He looked away from the supplies to me, fixing me in that cold, demented glare again. Again, Mr. Keller, I cannot say for certain. Those that embark on this trial do so alone. If it will answer your question, I will say that those I knew to have performed this ritual, I have not seen since. That was it. I couldn't take this ominously vague crap anymore, and I felt like this ritual, or whatever it was not a good idea. Okay, look, I'm not interested in whatever the hell this is, and my patience is just about gone, so I will ask you one more time to piss off and leave me alone. Like the last time, he just lowered his head and silently got up and left. I was then alone again in my cell, 2 days from execution. Funny enough, it actually took me a minute to realize that the man had left his stuff behind in my cell. Looking back, I am certain he did this on purpose. I spent hours just looking at the materials, thinking about everything the man said about this ritual. He had to have been nuts, I thought. How would I become perfect? I still wasn't sure what he even meant when he said perfect. Perfect how? And how exactly would this make me become perfect? Not to mention the idea that none who've attempted this have ever been seen again. Another part of me, however, couldn't help but look at the stuff he left behind, wondering what perfection would be like. No more pain, no flaws, none of the wickedness in your heart. I can't lie here. I know I said that I was beyond hoping for anything other than to burn for the things I'd done, which was true. That being said, that doesn't preclude me from the weight of my conscience. That's right. Yeah. Even a fiend like me has a bit of a heart, after all. Imagine that. I mean, yeah, it all still sounded like a load of crap, and it didn't sound like it would turn out good for anyone who did it. As far as I knew, it wasn't even possible to actually complete this ritual. And even if I did, what would even happen? Well, then again, what would I really be losing here if I did? It was with this in mind that I then began setting up everything for the ritual. Though I wasn't any devout Christian or anything like that, by any stretch of the imagination, I did believe there was a God out there. A God that would damn me as soon as he saw me. Anyway, I had set up the sticks in the form of the cross and tied the blindfold around my head before carving the X in my chest and reciting the incantation. In the names of those that stand beyond our veil, I offer unto thee my blood, my flesh, and my mind for sale. Take it, for I am thy damned lamb, and grant me perfection that I may never again fail. For about 5 minutes, nothing was happening. I started wondering what might happen when one of the guards walks by to see all of this. Then again, how had they not already? I guess that old goat went and managed to pay them off for that, too. Soon enough, I did start to hear the whispers I mentioned before. Something else I should mention about this is how real they will sound. What I mean by this is that they won't sound like some ghostly wail, like what you're probably thinking. No. These will sound like the voices of normal people. Clear and defined. And they sound like they're nearby. It was all so soft at first, and I thought it may have been a couple of the guards whispering outside my cell. Then, though, they got louder and louder. And I noticed how they were all in different languages. One was in Spanish, another, I think, was in German, and so on and so forth. A couple of them I'm not even sure were in any actual known language, more like some archaic tongues or something like that. Finally, they mixed together to form the words in English. I have come, my child. What doth thou seek? The voice was commanding and hypnotic in a way, despite it was also sounding half dead. My tongue was frozen for a moment before remembering what I had to say, stammering out. Perfection. Immediately, I cried out and seized in pain when I felt the stabbing in my hands and feet. The movements caused the pain to amplify. Once, I was able to force myself to lie still. I heard the voice ask me my name, age, birthday, sex, and my belief. I struggled to answer, feeling the constant pain and fighting the urges to seize up again. My name is Jeremiah Keller. I'm 35. Born April 6th, 1984. Male. The pain increased dramatically, feeling now like my hands and feet had been set on fire. And I heard the voice thunder in my head, asking me again what I believed in. After a moment's consideration and increasing pain, I finally blurted out,
Christian. Baptist.
Slowly, the burning subsided, and it went back to just feeling like my hands and feet were being stabbed. The voice then began to describe the time when I was 5, and I'd used to terrorize my neighbor's cat by nailing it with my Red Ryder. It also described how I would lie when questioned about it to get off scot-free. Finally, it asked me whether I admit my guilt or deny. I remembered what the man told me about being honest and confessing to my imperfections when he told me about this, and I had a feeling that lying would make the extra pain from before return.
Yes, I confess.
I let out a sharp yelp when the pain started erupting in the center of my chest as well as the rest. At first, I thought I was suffering from a heart attack, which made me seize again, which in turn caused the pain to increase again. Next, the voice started telling me about the time when I was 8, and I used the pocket knife I got for my birthday to shave my little sister's head in her sleep. This caused her to have to be rushed to the ER after I dug too deep and embedded part of it in her head. She survived, but now lives with major mental disabilities, chronic narcolepsy, severe amnesia, and even has trouble trying to talk because of it. When it asked me to confess or deny this time, I was a lot more hesitant to answer. It was one of the many horrible things I'd done that I honestly had damn near forgotten completely about until that moment. Reliving it like that, I was tempted to deny anything to get rid of the guilt again.
I deny.
That was my big mistake. Before I could even finish saying that, I felt the burning in my chest and limbs again, much worse this time. Of course, the extreme pain would cause me to seize again, and yes, this made it worse again.
All right, I confess, I did it! I fucking did it! God, I'm sorry!
Like before, my confession caused the burning to go away immediately. There was another minute before I could relax my body again, and the voice began another scene from my life. I don't know exactly how long it went on like this, the voice forcing me to confess to wrong or imperfect parts of my life while I struggled, both from physical and emotional pain, to answer the way I was supposed to. I know that. Like I've said, it gradually started describing to me the more and more horrific things I had done over the years up to the prison. The animals I used to torture just because. The children I used to kidnap and hold for ransom, some of which wouldn't live after I was through with them because Mommy and Daddy wouldn't pony up. The women I'd brutally tortured and raped until I could barely even breathe. All of it replayed by the voice in all their gruesome detail. And, of course, each confession caused the stabbing sensations to hurt worse and worse. Part of me wondered if this was what they meant in churches when they talk about divine judgment. In any case, I was indeed being judged here. What would result from it at that point was anybody's guess. Finally, I had confessed to my last imperfection, the murder of a man and his pregnant wife, the one that finally landed me here. My body was in so much pain by now, and I found myself wishing I had just chosen the needle. It then asked me if I wished to become perfect. I was almost too scared to answer. What would happen to me if I said no? Would the burning pains come back? Maybe it would be something that felt even worse. Then again, maybe nothing would happen. Maybe it'll just let me go, and I just go back to where I was before I started all of this. I figured, though, I'd managed to make it to here. What's the point in backing out now anyway? Whatever happens, one way or another, I'm a goner. With this, I answered yes. What happened next is still difficult to describe in a way that makes sense to you while being accurate. All at once, I felt a giant gust of frigid air blast the front of my face, and then I felt nothing. Now, when I say I felt nothing, that is exactly what I mean. Nothing. Physically, mentally, or even emotionally. Nothing. It was as if someone had hollowed me out like a watermelon, leaving just an empty shell. Because of this, I thought that I was dead at first. I realized otherwise, however, when I could hear sounds from all around me. They were voices, not like the ones I heard before, but actual people. I could hear all of them around me, chatting, laughing, even whispering. It was all just mundane stuff. Who's seeing who's running late, husbands telling their families, "I love you," before heading out, stuff like that. But I heard it and understood it all. And that wasn't all. I could hear the sounds of every single insect or animal scurrying and tittering by, all of it in painfully crystalline clarity. Slowly, I removed the blindfold from my eyes to see that I wasn't in my cell anymore. I was now in a large field of bright green grass. Looking around, I found that I could see everything as well. Every blade of grass was clear and defined to me in every detail. I saw clouds gathering overhead, and they were defined too, as was the tiny, crystal-clear droplets of water that fell from them. I know what you're thinking now, that I'm just on drugs or something, describing my latest trip, but no, this wasn't that. Trust me, I would know the difference between a trip and reality. This was reality. I wasn't sure how, but it was all real. I could now hear everything, see everything, understand everything. And yet, I felt nothing. Empty. I looked at my hands and my body to see that my skin was now pure ivory. I was naked and muscular, looking like a Greek god. I looked down to see a flower at my feet that was lilting. Stooping down, I touched it, and it immediately began to bloom into the most beautiful, radiant flower I had ever seen. I had the power to give life. I had the power to create. And yet still I felt nothing. Empty. I walked around the grassy plains and saw the grass and the flowers grow vibrant with every life under my feet. Eventually, I found a deer who'd been wounded, presumably by hunters. Like with the flower, one light tap of my finger, and its vitality was restored, darting off into the woods with more energy than ever. I could heal the sick. I could even raise the dead. Yet, I could feel absolutely Nothing. Empty. I could now do nothing but good for the world. I was now essentially a god. No, not a god. I was God. I could create, never destroy. I could heal, never harm. I could bring happiness, never despair. I could do all of this. And yet I couldn't feel. I was empty. No, not empty. Perfect. That was when I realized exactly what I had lost when I completed the ritual. I was now God on earth, but bound as a slave to perfection. I couldn't feel anymore. All the joy and happiness I now bring to others, and yet I have none of my own. And now, I never will again. I couldn't admire the things I could do now. I couldn't be proud of my new ways because I couldn't feel pride. I couldn't cry for joy when I'd see the hurt be healed by me because I couldn't feel joy or tears. I couldn't be angry or hurt when I saw something or someone suffering because I couldn't feel anger or pain anymore, or happiness, or sadness, or joy, or sorrow, or pride, or humility, everything. All gone. I wouldn't feel anything ever again. Empty. Perfect. As I said before, I've lived like this for 2 years now, devoid of any soul or humanity. I was an evil man, set to die in 2 days, and now I'm something else entirely. Something more, and at the same time, something less. And I will continue to live like this, a slave to perfection itself, until the end of time. For I, myself, cannot die, only live, only live. Now that I've told you all of this, let me ask you, would you wish to be perfect?
There was once a grown-up lad in the county Leitrim, and he was strong and lively and the son of a rich farmer. His father had plenty of money, and he did not spare it on the son. Accordingly, when the boy grew up, he liked sport better than work, and as his father had no other children, he loved this one so much that he allowed him to do in everything just as it pleased himself. He was very extravagant, and he used to scatter the gold money as another person would scatter the white. He was seldom to be found at home, but if there was a fair, or a race, or a gathering within 10 miles of him, you were dead certain to find him there. And he seldom spent a night in his father's house, but he used to be always out rambling, and like Sean Bui long ago, there was the love of every girl in the breast of his shirt, and its many, the kiss he got and he gave, for he was very handsome, and there wasn't a girl in the country but would fall in love with him, only for him to fasten his 2 eyes on her, and it was for that reason someone immortalized him in a poem. Look at the rogue. It's for kisses he's rambling. It wasn't much wonder, for what was his way? He's like an old hedgehog, at night he'll be scrambling from this place to that, but he'll sleep in the day. At last he became very wild and unruly. He wasn't to be seen day or night in his father's house, but always rambling or going on his night visit from place to place, and from house to house, so that the old people used to shake their heads and say to one another, "It's easy seen what will happen to the land when the old man dies. His son will run through it in a year, and it won't stand him that long itself." He used to be always gambling and card-playing and drinking, but his father never minded his bad habits and never punished him. But it happened one day that the old man was told that his son had ruined the character of a girl in the neighborhood, and he was greatly angry, and he called his son to him and said to him quietly and sensibly, "O son," says he, "you know I've loved you greatly up to this, and I never stopped you from doing your choice thing, whatever it was. And I kept plenty of money with you, and I always hoped to leave you the house and land, and all I had after myself would be gone. But I heard a story of you today that has disgusted me with you. I cannot tell you the grief that I felt when I heard such a thing of you, and I'll tell you now plainly that unless you marry that girl, I'll leave the house and land and everything to my brother's son. I never could leave it to anyone who would make so bad a use of it as you do yourself, deceiving women and coaxing girls. Settle with yourself now whether you'll marry that girl and get my land as a fortune with her, or refuse to marry her and give up all that was coming to you. And tell me in the morning which of the two things you've chosen." "What? Impossible! Father, you wouldn't say that to me. And I, such a good son as I am. Who told you I wouldn't marry the girl?" says he. But his father was gone, and the lad knew well enough that he would keep his word, too, and he was greatly troubled in his mind, for as quiet and as kind as his father was, he never went back of a word that he once said, and there wasn't another man in the country who was harder to bend than he was. The boy did not know rightly what to do. He was in love with the girl, indeed, and he hoped to marry her some time or other, but he would much sooner have remained another while he was, and follow on to his old tricks, drinking, sporting, and playing cards. And along with that he was angry that his father should order him to marry, and should threaten him if he did not. "Isn't my father a great fool?" he says to himself. "I was ready enough, and only too anxious, to marry Mary. And now, since he threatened me, faith, I've a great mind to let it go another while." His mind was so excited that he remained between two notions as to what to do. He walked out into the night at last to cool his heated blood, and went on to the road. He lit a pipe, and as the night was fine, he walked on and on, until the quick pace made him begin to forget his trouble. The night was bright, and the moon half full. There was not a breath of wind blowing, and the air was calm and mild. He walked on for nearly 3 hours, when he suddenly remembered that it was late in the night, and time for him to turn. "Gah! Look at the time. I think I forgot myself," he says. "It must be near 12 o'clock now." The word was hardly out of his mouth when he heard the sound of many voices and the trampling of feet on the road before him. "I don't know who it can be so late at night as this, on such a lonely road," he said to himself. He stood listening, and he heard the voices of many people talking through other, but he could not understand what they were saying. "Oh, Mother of God," says he, "I'm afraid. It's not Irish or English they have. It can't be. They're Frenchmen." Went on a couple of yards further, and he saw well enough by the light of the moon a band of little people coming toward him, and they were carrying something big and heavy with him. "Oh, murder," he says to himself. "Sure it can't be that they're the good people that's in it." Every rib of hair that was on his head stood up, and there fell a shaking on his bones, for he saw that they were coming to him fast. He looked at them again and perceived that there were about 20 little men in it, and there was not a man at all of them higher than about 3 feet or 3 feet and a half, and some of them were gray and seemed very old. He looked again, but he could not make out what the heavy thing they were carrying was until they came up to them, and then they all stood round him. They threw the heavy thing down in the road, and he saw on the spot that it was a dead body. He became cold as the death, and there was not a drop of blood running in his vein, when an old gray manine came up to him and said, "Isn't it lucky we met you, Teig O'Kane?" Poor Teig could not bring out a word at all, nor open his lips if he were to get the world for it, and so he gave no answer. "Teig O'Kane," said the little gray man again, "isn't it timely you met us?" Teig could not answer him. "Teig O'Kane," says he, "the third time, isn't it lucky and timely that we met you?" But Teig remained silent, for he was afraid to return an answer, and his tongue was as if it was tied to the roof of his mouth. The little gray man turned to his companions, and there was joy in his bright little eye. "And now," says he, "Teig O'Kane hasn't said a word. We can do with him what we please. Teig, Teig," says he, "you're living a bad life, and we can make a slave of you now, and you cannot withstand us, for there's no use in trying to go against us. Lift that corpse." Teig was so frightened that he was only able to utter 2 words. "I won't." For as frightened as he was obstinate and stiff, the same as ever. "Teig O'Kane won't lift the corpse," said the little man with a wicked little laugh, for all the world like the breaking of a bundle of dry twigs, and with a harsh little voice, like the striking of a cracked bell. "Teig O'Kane won't lift the corpse. Make him lift it." And before the word was out of his mouth, they all had gathered round poor Teig, and they were talking and laughing through other. Teig tried to run from them, but they followed him, and a man of them stretched out his foot before him as he ran, so that Teig was thrown in a heap of the road. Then, before he could rise up, the fairies caught him, some by the hands, some by the feet, and they held him tight in a way that he could not stir, with his face against the ground. 6 or 7 of them raised the body then, and pulled it over to him, and left it down on his back. The breast of the corpse was squeezed against Teig's back and shoulders, and the arms of the corpse were thrown around Teig's neck. Then they stood back from him a couple of yards, and let him get up. He rose, foaming at the mouth and cursing, and he shook himself, thinking to throw the corpse off his back. But his fear and his wonder were great when he found that the 2 arms had a tight hold around his own neck, and that the 2 legs were squeezing his hips firmly, and that, however strongly he tried, he could not throw it off, any more than a horse can throw off its saddle. He was terribly frightened then, and he thought he was lost. "Woe to me forever," said he to himself. "It's a bad life I'm leading that hasn't given the good people this power over me. I promised to God, Mary, Peter and Paul, Patrick and Bridget, that I'll mend my ways for as long as I have to live, if I come clear out of this danger, and I'll marry the girl." The gray little man came up to him again and said to him, "Now, Teig," says he, "you didn't lift the body when I told you to lift it. And see how you were made to lift it? Perhaps when I tell you to bury it, you won't bury it until you're made to bury it. Anything at all that I can do for your honor," said Teig, "I'll do it." For he was getting sense already, and if it had not been for the great fear that was on him, he never would have let that civil word slip out of his mouth. The little man laughed a sort of laugh again. "You're getting quiet now, Teig," says he. "I'll go bail, but you'll be quiet enough before I'm done with you. Listen to me now, Teig O'Kane, and if you don't obey me in all I'm telling you to do, you'll repent it. You must carry with you this corpse that is on your back to Timpole de Meuse, and you must bring it into the church with you and make a grave for it in the very middle of the church, and you must raise up the flags and put them down again the very same way, and you must carry the clay out of the church and leave the place as it was when you came, so that no one could know that there had been anything changed. But that's not all. Maybe that the body won't be allowed to be buried in that church. Perhaps some other man has the bed, and if so, it's likely he won't share it with this one. If you don't get leave to bury it in Timpole de Meuse, you must carry it to Kerk Fad Vic Oers and bury it in the churchyard there. And if you don't get it into that place, take it with you to Timpole Ronan. And if that churchyard is closed on you, take it to Imlog Fada. And if you're not being able to bury it there, you've no more to do than to take it to Kilbridge, and you can bury it there without hindrance. I cannot tell you what one of these churches is the one where you will leave to bury that corpse under the clay, but I know that it will be allowed you to bury him at some church or other of them. If you do this work rightly, we will be thankful to you, and you will have no cause to grieve. But if you are slow or lazy, believe me, we shall take satisfaction of you." When the gray little man had done speaking, his comrades laughed and clapped their hands together. "Glick, glick, whee, whee!" they all cried. Go on, go on. You have 8 hours before you till daybreak, and if you haven't this man buried before the sun rises, you're lost." They struck a fist and a foot behind him and drove him on the road. He was obliged to walk, and to walk fast, for they gave him no rest. He thought himself that there was not a wet path or a dirty lane or a crooked contrary road in the whole county that he had not walked that night. The night was at times very dark, and whenever there would come a cloud across the moon, he could see nothing, and then he used often to fall. Sometimes he was hurt, sometimes he escaped, but he was obliged to always rise on the moment and to hurry on. Sometimes the moon would break out clearly, and then he would look behind him and see the little people following at his back, and he heard them speaking amongst themselves, talking and crying out and screaming like a flock of seagulls, and if he was to save his soul, he never understood as much as one word of what they were saying. He did not know how far he had walked, when at last one of them cried out to him, "Stop here!" He stood, and they all gathered round him. "Do you see those withered trees over there?" said the old boy to him again. "Timpole de Meuse is among those trees, and you must go in there by yourself, for we cannot follow you or go with you. We must remain here. Go on boldly." Teig looked from him, and he saw a high wall that was, in places, half broken down, and an old great church on the inside of the wall, and about a dozen withered old trees scattered here and there around it. There was neither leaf nor twig on any of them, but their bare, crooked branches were stretched out like the arms of an angry man when he threatens. He had no help for it, but he was obliged to go for it. He was a couple of 100 yards from the church, but he walked on and never looked behind him until he came to the gate of the churchyard. The old gate was thrown down, and he had no difficulty in entering. He turned then to see if any of the little people were following him, but there came a cloud over the moon, and the night became so dark that he could see nothing. He went into the churchyard, and he walked up the old grassy pathway leading up to the church. When he reached the door, he found it locked. The door was large and strong, and he did not know what to do. At last he drew out his knife with difficulty and stuck it in the wood to try if it were not rotten, but it was not. "Now," he said to himself, "I have no more to do. The door is shut, and I can't open it." Before the words were rightly shaped in his own mind, a voice in his ear said to him, "Search for the key on the top of the door or on the wall." He started. "Who's that speaking to me?" he cried, turning round. But he saw no one. The voice said in his ear again, "Search for the key on the top of the door or on the wall." "Who's that? What's that?" he said, and the sweat running from his forehead. "Who spoke to me?" "It's I, the corpse that spoke to you," said the voice. "Can you talk?" said Teig. "Now and again," said the corpse. Teig searched for the key, and he found it on the top of the wall. He was too much frightened to say any more, but he opened the door wide, and as quickly as he could he went in, with the corpse on his back. It was as dark as pitch inside, and poor Teig began to shake and tremble. "Light the candle," said the corpse. Teig put his hand in his pocket, as well as he was able, and drew out a flint and steel. He struck a spark out of it, and lit a burnt rag he had in his pocket. He blew it until it made a flame, and he looked around him. The church was very ancient, and part of the wall was broken down. The windows were blown in or cracked, and the timber of the seats were rotten. There were 6 or 7 old iron candlesticks left there still, and in one of these candlesticks Teig found the stump of an old candle, and he lit it. He was still looking round him on the strange and horrid place in which he had found himself, when the cold corpse whispered in his ear, "Bury me now, bury me now. There's a spade, and turn the ground." Teig looked from him, and he saw a spade lying beside the altar. He took it up, and he placed the blade under a flag that was in the middle of the aisle, and leaning all his weight on the handle of the spade, he raised it. When the first flag was raised, it was not hard to raise the others near it, and he moved 3 or 4 of them out of their places. The clay that was under them was soft and easy to dig, but he had not thrown up more than 3 or 4 shovelfuls when he felt the iron touch something soft like flesh. He threw up 3 or 4 more shovelfuls from around it, and then he saw that it was another body that was buried in the same place. "I'm afraid I'll never be allowed to bury the 2 bodies in the same hole," said Teig in his own mind. "You corpse, there in my back," he says. "Will you be satisfied if I buried you down there?" But the corpse never answered him a word. "Well, that's a good sign," said Teig to himself. "Maybe he's getting quiet." And he thrust the spade down in the earth again. Perhaps he hurt the flesh of the other body, for the dead man that was buried there stood up in the grave and shouted an awful shout. "Ho, ho, ho! Go, go, go! Or you're a dead man! Dead, dead, dead man!" And then he fell back in the grave again. Teig said afterward that of all the wonderful things that he saw that night, that was the most awful to him. His hair stood upright on his head like the bristles of a pig. The cold sweat ran off his face, and then came a tremor over all of his bones until he thought that he must fall. But after a while he became bolder, when he saw that the second corpse remained lying quietly there, and he threw in the clay on it again and he smoothed it overhead. He laid down the flags carefully, as they had been before. "It can't be that he'll rise up any more," said he. He went down the aisle a little further and drew near to the door and began raising the flags again, looking for another bed for the corpse on his back. He took up 3 or 4 flags and put them aside, and then he dug the clay. He was not long digging until he laid bare an old woman without a thread upon her but her shirt. She was more lively than the first corpse, for he had scarcely taken any of the clay away from about her when she sat up and began to cry, "Ha! You clown! You fool! Where has been that he got no bed?" Poor Teig drew back, and when she found that she was getting no answer, she closed her eyes gently, lost her vigor, and fell back quietly and slowly under the clay. Teig did to her as he had done to the man. He threw the clay back on her and left the flags down overhead. He began digging again near the door, but before he had thrown up more than a couple of shovelfuls, he noticed a man's hand lay bare by the spade. "By my soul, I'll go no further then," he said to himself. "What use is it for me?" And he threw the clay on it again and settled the flags as they had been seen before. He left the church then, and his heart was heavy enough, but he shut the door and locked it, and left the key where he found it. He sat down on the tombstone that was near the door and began thinking. He was in great doubt what he should do. He laid his face between his 2 hands and cried for grief and fatigue, since he was dead certain at this time that he never would come home alive. He made another attempt to loosen the hands of the corpse that were squeezed round his neck, but they were as tight as if they were clamped, and the more he tried to loosen them, the tighter they squeezed him. He was going to sit down once more, when the cold, horrid lips of the dead man said to him, "Carrick fad vic oris," and he remembered the command of the good people to bring the corpse with him to that place, if he should be unable to bury it where he had been. He rose up and looked about him. "I don't know the way," he said. As soon as he had uttered the word, the corpse stretched out suddenly its left hand that had been tightened around his neck, and kept it pointing out, showing him the road he ought to follow. Teig went in the direction that the fingers were stretched, and passed out in the churchyard. He found himself on an old, ruddy, stony road, and he stood still again, not knowing where to turn. The corpse stretched out its bony hand a second time, and pointed out to him another road, not the road by which he had come when approaching the old church. Teig followed that road, and whenever he came to a path or road meeting it, the corpse always stretched out its hand and pointed with its fingers, showing him the way he was to take. Many were crossroads he turned down, and many were the crooked lanes he walked, until he saw from him an old burying ground at last, beside the road. But there was neither church nor chapel, nor any other building in it. The corpse squeezed him tightly, and he stood. Bury me in the burying ground," said the voice. Teig drew over toward the old burying place, and he was not more than about 20 yards from it when, raising his eyes, he saw hundreds and hundreds of ghosts, men, women, and children, sitting on top of the wall round it, or standing on the inside of it, or running backwards and forwards and pointing at him, while he could see their mouths opening and shutting as if they were speaking, though he heard no word nor any sound amongst them all. He was afraid to go forward, so he stood where he was, and the moment he stood, all the ghosts became quiet and ceased moving. Then Teig understood that it was trying to keep him from going in, that they were. He walked a couple of yards forward, and immediately the whole crowd rushed together toward the spot to which he was moving, and they stood so thickly together that it seemed to him that he could never break through them, even though he had a mind to try. but he had no mind to try it. He went back broken and dispirited, and when he had gone a couple of 100 yards from the burying ground, he stood again, for he did not know which way to go. He heard the voice of the corpse in his ear saying, "Timbo Ronin," and the skinny hand was stretched out again, pointing him out the road. As tired as he was, he had to walk, and the road was neither short nor even. The night was darker than ever, and it was difficult to make his way. Many was the toss he got, and many a bruise they left on his body. At last he saw Timbo Ronin from him in the distance, standing in the middle of the burying ground. He moved over toward it, and thought he was all right and safe, when he saw neither ghosts nor anything else on the wall, and he thought he would never be hindered now from leaving his load off him at last. He moved over to the gate, but as he was passing in, he tripped on the threshold. Before he could recover himself, something that he could not see seized him by the neck, by the hands, and by the feet, and bruised him and shook him and choked him until he was nearly dead. And at last he was lifted up and carried more than 100 yards from that place, and then thrown down in an old dike with the corpse still clinging to him. He rose up bruised and sore, but feared to go near the place again, for he had seen nothing the time he was thrown down and carried away. "You, corpse, up on my back," he said. "Shall I go over again to the churchyard?" But the corpse never answered him. "That's a sign you don't wish me to try it again?" said Teig. He was now in great doubt as to what he ought to do, when the corpse spoke in his ear and said, "Imlag Fada." "Oh, murder," said Teig. "Must I bring you there? If you keep me long walking like this, I tell you I'll fall under you." He went on, however, in the direction the corpse pointed out to him. He could not have told himself how long he had been going, when the dead man behind suddenly squeezed him and said, "There!" Teig looked from him, and he saw a little low wall that was so broken down in places that it was no wall at all. It was in a great wide field in from the road, and only for 3 or 4 great stones at the corners that were more like rocks than stones. There was nothing to show that there was either graveyard or burying ground there. "Is this Imlag Fada? Shall I bury you here?" said Teig. "Yes," said the voice. "But I see no grave or gravestone, only this pile of stones," said Teig. The corpse did not answer, but stretched out its long, fleshless hand to show Teig the direction in which he was to go. Teig went on accordingly, but he was greatly terrified, for he remembered what had happened to him at the last place. He went on with his heart in his mouth, as he said himself afterward, but when he came to within 15 or 20 yards of the little low square wall, there broke out a flash of lightning, bright yellow and red, with blue streaks in it, and went round the wall in one course, and it swept by as fast as the swallow in the clouds, and the longer Teig remained looking at it, the faster it went, till at last it became like a bright ring of flame round the old graveyard, which no one could pass without being burnt by it. Teig never saw, from the time he was born, and never saw afterward, so wonderful or so splendid a sight as that was. Round went the flame, white and yellow and blue sparks, leaping out from it as it went, and although at first it had been no more than a thin narrow line, it increased slowly until it was at last a great broad band, and it was continually getting broader and higher, and throwing out more brilliant sparks, till there was never a color on the ridge of the earth that was not to be seen in that fire, and lightning never shone, and flame never flamed, that was so shining and so bright as that. Teig was amazed. He was half dead with fatigue, and he had no courage left to approach the wall. There fell a mist over his eyes, and he was overcome with vertigo, and he was obliged to sit down upon a great stone to recover himself. He could see nothing but the light, and he could hear nothing but the whir of it as it shot round the paddock faster than a flash of lightning. As he sat there on the stone, the voice whispered once more into his ear, "Kill Breeja." And the dead man squeezed him so tightly that he cried out. He rose again, sick, tired, and trembling, and went forward as he was directed. The wind was cold, and the road was bad, and the load upon his back was heavy, and the night was dark, and he himself was nearly worn out, and if he had had very much further to go, he must have fallen dead under his burden. At last the corpse stretched out its hand and said to him, "Bury me there." "This is the last burying place," said Teig in his own mind, "and the little gray man said I'd be allowed to bury him in some of them, so it must be this. It can't be, but they'll let him in here." The first faint streak of the ring of day was appearing in the east, and the clouds were beginning to catch fire, but it was darker than ever, for the moon was set and there were no stars. Make haste, said the corpse, and Teig hurried forward as well as he could to the graveyard, which was a little place on a bare hill with only a few graves in it. He walked boldly in through the open gate, and nothing touched him, nor did he either hear or see anything. He came to the middle of the ground and then stood up and looked round him for a spade or shovel to make a grave. As he was turning round and searching, he suddenly perceived what startled him greatly: a newly dug grave right before him. He moved over to it and looked down, and there at the bottom he saw a black coffin. He clambered down into the hole and lifted the lid and found that, as he thought it would be, the coffin was empty. He had hardly mounted up out of the hole and was standing on the brink when the corpse, which had clung to him for more than 8 hours, suddenly relaxed its hold on his neck and loosened its shin from around his hips and sank down with a plop into the open coffin. Teig fell down on his 2 knees at the brink of the grave and gave thanks to God. He made no delay then, but pressed down the coffin lid in its place and threw in the clay over it with his 2 bare hands. And when the grave was filled up, he stamped and leaped on it with its feet until it was firm and hard, and then he left the place. The sun was fast rising as he finished his work, and the first thing he did was to return to the road and look out for a house to rest in. He found an inn at last and lay down upon a bed there and slept till night. Then he rose up and ate a little and fell asleep again till morning. When he awoke in the morning, he hired a horse and rode home. He was more than 26 miles from home where he was, and he had come all that way with the dead body on his back in one night. All the people at his own home thought he must have left the country, and they rejoiced greatly when they saw him come back. Everyone began asking him where he had been, but he would not tell anyone except his father. He was a changed man from that day. He never drank too much, he never lost his money over cards, and especially he would not take the world and be out late by himself of a dark night. He was not a fortnight at home until he married Mary, the girl he had been in love with, and it's at their wedding the sport was, and it's he was the happy man from that day forward, and it's all I wish that we may be as happy as he was.
The pothole appeared out of nowhere.
"Son of a bitch!"
Miles Freeman uttered, swerving to miss it. The RAV4's right tire strafed the hole's edge, but managed to avoid plunging into it.
"Whoa,
His 12-year-old son, Brandon, said from the back seat.
close one."
Easing the SUV back into its lane, Miles glanced in the rear view and met his son's gaze. The boy's bleary eyes swam in their sockets, a result Miles knew of the pain meds the ER staff had pumped into him.
Sorry about that, bud. This road isn't the greatest. It's okay, Dad. It's Syracuse. That it is,
Miles agreed.
City of salt and potholes. How's the leg?
Brandon glanced down at his heavily bandaged thigh.
Achy. How many stitches did I get again? 8, which you took like a champ. Think I'll have a scar? Probably.
The boy grinned dopily.
Battle trophy.
Miles reached back and touched the boy's hand.
Hey, I want to talk about what happened. In more detail than what you told the doctors, I mean.
Brandon shrugged.
Okie dokie, doggy daddy.
Miles smirked at that one. One of his favorite lines from True Romance, that badass Christian Slater flick from the early 90s. The boy had never actually seen the movie. No, the violence was too excessive for a child. He had simply heard Miles say it once and thereafter adopted it for himself.
All right, knucklehead. Shut your eyes for me and think back to this morning, when you got the ouchie in your leg.
Brandon closed his eyes.
They're shut? Now concentrate hard and describe what happened. Well,
Brandon said,
I was grabbing branches for the trail and I saw a nice big one in the area that doesn't have any trees. Something tripped me as I went to grab it and I fell over. And my leg went right into that metal thingy.
Miles nodded. They had been in the woods bordering their backyard working on their big summer project, clearing a system of trails in the underbrush. Brandon had been out hunting for branches with which to line the trail while Miles busied himself trimming the path with hedge clippers. After a time, Brandon had wandered out of sight and into a nearby clearing. Next Miles knew, the boy was screaming bloody murder. Miles found him sitting on a log, hand pressed hard against his thigh, applying pressure to the wound, just as Miles had taught him.
This metal thingy,
Miles said.
It was sticking up out of the ground, right? Right. I know you told the doctor you couldn't remember, but think hard for me. Was it smooth or rough?
Brandon shook his head.
Don't know. It was real fast.
Miles pursed his lips. The ER doc that had treated Brandon couldn't say one way or the other either. What she could say for certain was that it had been rusty, given the tiny rust flakes she found while abrading the wound.
No worries, Miles said. So the thing poked you. What happened next? Did you push yourself off it and fall on your butt?
Brandon cocked his head like a dog keying into an interesting noise.
No, there was a breaking sound, a snap, and I fell down. There was a piece of it sticking out of my leg. I yanked it out and dropped it.
That was new information.
A snapping sound? You think you broke it off something?
Brandon opened his eyes.
Uh-huh. Just remembered. After. It hurt real bad and was bleeding, so I did like you showed me to make it stop. I'm real proud of you for that, too,
Miles said.
Quick thinking.
It occurred to Miles then how fortunate they were the object had merely pierced the boy's leg versus his belly or chest, or, God forbid, his head. The very thought made Miles queasy. He truly couldn't fathom an existence without Brandon. It was hard enough losing the boy's mother in childbirth. If he ever lost Brandon too, he didn't know what he would do. No, that was a lie. He knew exactly what he would do, and it involved the Mossberg 500 shotgun tucked away in his closet. Miles blinked and ran a hand through his curly mane, which some people said made him resemble a taller Patrick Dempsey.
You hungry for lunch yet? Sure,
Brandon said.
Peter Palace.
Brandon's eyebrows arched. Mediterranean was his favorite.
Oh yeah. Gyros. Por favor. All right, pal. Gyros it is.
By the time they finished chowing down at home, Brandon was in tears again from the pain. Miles gave him a hydrocodone, as prescribed by the ER, and got him set up on the living room sofa.
Xbox or Oculus?
Miles asked.
Xbox. Minecraft Retro. Shocker. But that's okay. You deserve it. Do all the mining and crafting you want today.
Miles handed the boy his game controller.
If you're okay for a bit, I need to go out back and look around for whatever poked you. Make sure it's safe. Cozies,
Brandon said, turning his attention to the living room's 55-inch TV. Before heading out, Miles hurried down to the basement and retrieved their walkie-talkie set from the workroom.
Here,
He said as he returned to the living room. He placed one of the handsets on the end table next to the sofa.
if you need anything, use this to reach me. You remember how to use it?
push to talk.
That's right.
Miles tousled the boy's hair and headed for the back door. During his youth, Miles had spent a lot of time outdoors. His own father had been an avid outdoorsman and took care to instill his spirit of adventure in Miles. Miles had wanted to do the same for Brandon, but the kid preferred exploring the wondrous landscapes of his imagination over those in the real world. If it wasn't written in one of his books or coded into one of his video games, he just wasn't interested. Fortunately, that all changed the previous summer after Brandon finished reading The Wild Folk by Sylvia Lindstedt. They had been on the back deck at the time, letting their dinners digest while gazing at the woods that lay beyond their property line.
Dad,
Brandon had said,
I want to go into the woods, make a trail through the trees. I think I belong out there.
Miles had been so happy he nearly cried.
Absolutely,
He had said, and thus the big summer project was born. Smiling at the memory, Miles stepped onto the back deck and shut the door behind them. The afternoon greeted him with a sweltering embrace.
Good Christ,
He said, checking the weather stats on his phone. 92 degrees, it said, with 40% humidity. Already beginning to sweat, he wiped his face and vaulted off the deck into the backyard. It was marginally cooler once he reached the trailhead, as the wood's canopy provided a ton of shade, but the air was still stifling as hell. Wondering if he hadn't somehow been magically transported to Mississippi, he followed the path as it zigged and zagged its way through the dense cluster of oaks and pines that imbued his little swath of central New York. At the trail's terminus, Miles discovered the hedge clippers he had dropped when Brandon had cried out.
right.
He said, holding them up in front of him. He couldn't say why, but in that moment, he found their slender blades rather comforting. Comforting, he thought, unsure where the notion had come from. Did he think some sort of thread existed amongst all the fern, ivy, and honeysuckle? Like a rabid fox or killer rabbits?
Sure,
Miles said.
why not killer bunnies? I hear they're all the rage this season.
Having a watership down moment, are we? A voice inquired behind them. Startled, Miles whipped around in a panic and readied the hedge clippers for combat. Easy there, said Jacob Winslow, Miles' next-door neighbor. He raised his hands like a cornered bank robber. I come in peace.
Jesus Christ,
Miles snarled, lowering the clippers.
where the fuck did you come from?
Jacob dropped his hands. Sorry, dude. I thought you heard me approach. Miles glowered down at his pale, red-haired neighbor, who stood a foot shorter than him.
I didn't hear shit.
Not sure what to tell you, amigo, the man said. I wasn't being particularly stealthy. Miles drew in a deep breath and let it out slowly.
Fine, whatever. Is there something I can help you with?
Oh, Jacob said. I, heard about what happened to your boy. Ted from across the street filled me in, and figured I'd see if you needed a hand with anything. You didn't answer your doorbell, so I peeked out back and saw you heading into the woods. Miles squinted at the man. On top of being a prying snoop with little respect for other people's boundaries, Jacob Winslow was bar none the least neighborly neighbor Miles had ever met, especially when it came to helping out with anything. If it wasn't his bad back or ulcer acting up again, he always seemed to have errands to run or relatives to visit. Conversely, the little shit had no issue asking for anyone else's help. Yet here he was now offering his assistance. It was strange to say the least. Even stranger, though, was the fact that Jacob knew anything at all about Brandon's injury. Other than the hospital staff, Miles hadn't shared what had happened with anyone.
Ted?
Miles asked.
And what did he say?
Not much, just that your boy landed in the ER with an injured leg, and that he was home now doing okay. The shorter man observed the consternation on Miles' face. Oh, Ted only knows because of Gina.
Gina.
Miles echoed.
Right.
Ted's wife, Gina, worked as a nurse at the Golisano Children's Hospital. He hadn't seen her during their visit, but he supposed she could have seen Brandon's name on the patient register and decided to check his file. Miles studied his neighbor for a length, thinking, then revisited the man's offer to help.
Well,
he said, redirecting his attention to the clearing.
if the offer to lend a hand is serious, I was about to search for whatever jabbed Brandon in the thigh. I only have a vague sense of where it occurred. I was busy whacking away at the weeds where we were standing when he cried out. I found him sitting in the clearing over there.
Jacob nodded.
Not to be a nosy Nelly, but why were you gents out here in the first place?
Miles told him about the summer project.
Gotcha. And you want to make sure the pokey bit isn't still a problem?
Bingo.
Jacob considered their surrounding and glanced down at his own attire, which consisted of a Budweiser t-shirt, cargo shorts, and a pair of flip-flops.
I'm clearly not dressed for the occasion. Nope,
Miles said.
The poison oak and ivy out here will fuck you up.
Far enough. I'll be right back,
Jacob replied, ambling back towards his house. He returned minutes later, garbed in a blue long-sleeve shirt, jeans, boots, work gloves, and a fitted Yankees cap.
That's better. Let's just pray I don't die from heat exhaustion.
Fresh rivulets of sweat ran down Miles' back.
You and me both. Ready to get started?
Let's do it.
5 minutes into their scouring, Jacob came across a bulky wasp nest forged in the crook of a dead sugar maple.
Check this out.
Miles stayed where he was. He wanted no part of the dozen or so wasps buzzing about the nest.
Industrious sons of bitches, huh?
Jacob grunted.
They've set up shop in a couple spots around my house. I'm going to hit up Home Depot for some supplies and go on a killing spree.
You don't use an exterminator?
Miles asked.
No, more satisfying to handle it myself.
If you say so. Me, I like not being stung.
We all get stung sooner or later,
Jacob said.
That's life.
Miles shuffled away from the busy nest.
I suppose. Luckily, I've never been allergic.
The sound of his own words resonated queerly in his head, and for an instant he was bombarded by a flurry of images. A beehive in an old barn, a curious child with a stick, a barking dog, angry bees swarming the child, slapping and whimpering, silence and stillness, the child's bloated head, and dead eyes.
Hey,
Jacob interjected.
You all right?
Miles glanced at the man.
What? No, yeah. It's...
Just then, his foot landed on a thin cylindrical object which rolled with his stepping motion.
Shit!
He blurted out, stumbling backwards. By some miracle, he managed to keep his footing. Jacob chuckled.
Man, gravity's a bitch sometimes, huh?
Miles squatted down and searched the brush for whatever he had stepped on. The object was hidden within a clump of honeysuckle. He extracted it and lifted it into plain view. It was maybe a foot long, all rust, one end badly corroded, the other dappled with ants feeding on a darkened substance. Jacob frowned.
Is that a piece of rebar?
Miles turned it over in his hand.
Looks like it.
Is that what got your boy?
I think so,
Miles said.
I would have looked for it before going to the hospital, but I was more concerned with stopping the bleeding.
Jacob's frown deepened. He glanced around.
What the fuck would that even be doing out here?
That's the $25,000 question, isn't it?
Miles said.
I think it was sticking out of the ground. At an angle, maybe. Brandon went to pick up a branch, stumbled, and landed on it. I'm guessing his weight was enough to snap it where it's decayed.
He stooped over and began rummaging through the surrounding brush.
Hang on. It's got to be here somewhere.
What does?
Asked Jacob.
Ah, there we are.
Miles switched from rummaging to pulling away large tufts of honeysuckle. A half-dozen pulls later, he stopped and moved aside.
Look.
Jacob looked. At the center of the now bare honeysuckle patch stood a rather guilty-looking nub of rusted metal.
Well, that opens up a whole other can of worms, doesn't it?
Sure does,
Miles said.
First in my mind is, how far into the ground does it go?
He reached down, gripped the nub tightly, and attempted to move it back and forth. It moved 1/4 of an inch in either direction, but that was all. Miles clamped his other hand on the thing and tried again, achieving the same result.
Looks like it's in there pretty deep.
Which means it probably didn't fall from something tall,
Jacob deduced, looking up.
Though I'm not sure what that thing would be.
Me neither,
Miles said.
From what I understand, this whole area wasn't developed until the Renfrew Company purchased it some 30 years ago. Before that, it was all just wild land.
Then what the fuck?
Miles planted his hands on his hips.
To tell you the truth, I don't really care about the why of it right now.
Jacob removed his Yankees cap and wiped his brow. His short red hair looked like orange fire in the bright sunlight.
You want to know if more of these things exist?
Yep,
Miles said.
Once I have that answered, I'll move on to how deep they go, then try to solve the why.
Roger that, amigo.
Miles examined the clearing.
If you're still up for it, want to help me look?
Jacob flipped his cap back onto his head.
I'm already sweaty, and I don't have shit to do until tonight. I say let's keep the good times rolling.
Miles nodded, and they set to it. Later, after a long hot shower, Miles shuffled into the living room and plopped down on the sofa next to Brandon.
What you up to, compadre?
Brandon pointed at the TV screen. On it, Jake the dog and Finn the human were battling the Ice King, who once again kidnapped Princess Bubblegum.
Adventure time, huh?
Miles said.
Where the fun will never end.
Gotta love the classics.
Miles eyed the boy's leg.
How you doing?
Brandon ran his index finger over the bandages.
Bad biscuits.
Interpreting that as a negative response, Miles got him another pill and a glass of water.
Sorry, bud. That should kick in soon enough. In the meantime, want to hear something crazy?
Brandon lit up at that.
Always.
So, you know the spiky thing that poked you in the thigh?
No. Doesn't ring a bell.
Funny,
Miles said.
Well, I actually found it in the woods. Looks to be a piece of rebar. A steel rod they put in concrete to help make it stronger. Anyhow, in addition to the piece that got you, I found the bit it broke off from. I tried to pull that bit out of the ground, but couldn't. It's in there deep.
Brandon giggled at something Jake had just yelled at Finn. Miles waited until the episode ended, then shut the TV off.
Hey,
Brandon said.
I want to keep watching.
You can,
Miles assured him.
I just want to discuss something first without any distractions.
Brandon simpered but didn't protest.
Good,
Miles said.
So listen, along with the rebar that hurt you, guess what I found?
Princess Bubblegum?
No. 5 other pieces of rebar sticking up out of the ground.
Brandon's face bunched up.
6 rebar thingies?
Yeah, in that clearing, hidden by bushes and tall grass.
Weird. Why are they there?
No clue, but I think they're connected to something underground.
Underground? Like what?
Again, no clue, but I'm going to find out.
Miles sighed and sank back into the couch.
After a few days' rest, though. Your dad isn't the spring chicken he used to be.
He thought of the upcoming work week at his accounting firm, which looked to be a hellish one.
Next weekend, most likely.
Awesome,
Brandon said, eyes returning to the TV.
Can I watch more Finn and Jake now?
Miles powered on the device and handed the boy the remote.
Sure, bud, sure.
The following Friday night, Miles and Brandon decided to have a pizza and movie night. Brandon suggested cloudy with a chance of meatballs as the main feature, so Miles ordered a couple of meatball pies. Early the next morning, Brandon crept into bed with Miles, claiming he had had a really bad dream. Miles asked if he remembered what it was about.
Yes,
Brandon said.
A bad man trapped me in the basement and stuck a spear into my belly. I was screaming for you the whole time.
Miles held him tight, and together they fell back asleep, rising again around 10:30. After breakfast, Miles got the boys started on his math homework and ensured both of their walkie-talkies were good to go.
Working on the trail some more?
Brandon inquired.
Sort of,
Miles said.
Like I said last night, I need to figure out what all the rebar connects to.
I want to go with you and help. My leg feels a lot better.
I know, and I love our team-ups, but the doctor prescribed 2 weeks rest with minimal walking. You can help by resting, and we'll see where we're at in a week. Brandon sighed. Fine. Miles gave the boy a walkie-talkie. Same channel as before. I'll be back in a while. The temperature outside was cooler than it had been of late, mid-80s with a decent breeze. I'll take it, Miles said to the universe. From the shed he gathered a bag of tools, shovel, spade, pickaxe, sledgehammer, and hauled it to the clearing. His plan was to start at the foremost rebar tine, the one that had injured Brandon. Dig down until he uncovered its origin, then move on to the others. Here goes nothing, he said, and commenced digging. The shovel made quick work of the surprisingly pliable earth seated around the rebar. It was looser than he expected and came up easier than store-bought potting soil. About 2 feet down, the shovel's blade struck something hard and metallic, and seemingly hollow. What the shit? He cleared away 10 more shovelfuls of the loose stuff and set the shovel aside. From the hole, a jagged square foot of blue-gray metal stared up at him. The rebar tine he saw was welded to the metal surface. Baffled, Miles tapped the surface with the heel of his boot and listened as it issued a dull reverberation. Definitely hollow, he said. He wondered if it could have been an old oil or septic tank for some home that had once stood in the clearing. If so, it must have been one whopper of a place because oil and septic tanks weren't typically as big as this structure seemed to be. As to why it had rebar tine sticking out of it, no rational explanation came to mind. After radioing Brandon to see if he was okay, Miles moved on to the remaining pieces of rebar. The result was the same at each, rusty blue-gray metal and the welding joint keeping the rebar in place. He looked for words printed on the metal surface but found none. Unsure what to think, Miles retreated to the unfinished pathway and enjoyed a well-earned break in the shade. As he did, he decided to unearth the whole top portion of the damn structure, see if he could locate any markings. He just wasn't sure he wanted to do all that today or wait until tomorrow. He was on the verge of calling it quits when Jacob came ambling up the trail, shovel in hand.
Howdy, neighbor. Back at it again, I see. Need a hand?
Miles noticed the man was decked out in a flannel shirt, jeans, gloves, a hat, and boots.
Sure. Looks like you came to party.
Jacob chuckled.
Just got back from visiting family in Utica and could stand to blow off some steam.
He reached the clearing and appraised Miles' handiwork.
You've been busy.
Miles filled him in on his theory about the oil/septic tank.
No shit,
Jacob said, kicking the metal surface with one of his steel-toed boots. The sound of it reverberating made him grin.
The mystery literally deepens. What's the plan?
I was thinking I'd dig out the areas between the rebar and check for markings.
Jacob moved to the furthest hole and readied his shovel.
Tally fucking ho!
He said and drove the shovel's blade into the ground. At 4:15, Miles stopped digging and peered down at his boot. His shovel had just struck something about half a foot down.
That's different,
he said.
What's that?
Jacob queried. Miles levered his shovel 90 degrees, prying loose a hefty chunk of earth.
Unsure. Come help me real fast.
He tossed the chunk aside and repeated the process. Jacob joined them, and together they swiftly uncovered the irregularity.
Jesus,
Jacob said, staring at it.
Is that what I think it is?
Yeah,
said Miles.
It's a fucking hatch door.
It certainly looked the part. Circular, 3 foot in diameter, robust hinge, full-on hand wheel, like something off the International Space Station. Jacob fiddled with an object attached to the hatch's lower curve. He brushed dirt off it and held it in his palm. It was a padlock, a large and new-looking one at that.
Seems like someone doesn't want us accessing the Red October here,
Jacob said.
I have a badass set of bolt cutters in the shed,
Miles offered.
Terrific. Let's get that bad boy and see what's inside this thing.
Miles peered at the padlock. Why did it look so new when everything else seemed so rusty and old?
I think we're going to have to save that for tomorrow morning. I'm losing steam. I want to finish digging out the top part and then go hang out with Brandon.
Saying the boy's name elicited an unexpected swell of emotion and anxiety.
Got more restraint than I do,
Jacob said, resuming his shoveling.
But that's cool. Adds to the mystique of it. Just make sure you come get me before you shear that sucker off. I'm dying to know what's in there.
Miles transferred his gaze to the hand wheel.
Me too,
he lied. He couldn't pinpoint why, but the prospect of discovering what lay within the buried structure suddenly filled him with dread. Something bad was in there. He was sure of it. Something to do with Brandon. He tried to shake the awful notion from his mind, but it refused to go. Distraught, he plunged his shovel's blade into the ground and extracted a large clod of dirt. As he cast it into the clearing, the first wave of mosquitoes arrived, targeting their faces and necks. They both applied more DEET and did their best to finish as soon as possible. As thanks for all his help, Miles invited Jacob to dinner. Jacob graciously accepted. After a hasty shower at his house, he came over with a 6-pack of Miller Lite in one hand and a 2-liter of Coke in the other. In no mood to cook, Miles grub-hubbed a pile of KFC and they happily chowed down on the Colonel's famous recipe. While they ate, Jacob filled Brandon in on the hatch situation and its stalwart padlock. The boy was utterly fascinated by the revelation, so much so that he abandoned his meal and began limping around the living room like an agitated dog.
Why's it there?
He burbled as he limped.
Why's it locked? What's inside? Treasure? Monsters? And why's the lock new? And who put it there?
And so on and so forth. When several minutes later Miles finally intervened, he didn't bother using any of his gentle tactics. He went right to the nuclear option.
Brandon, return to the dinner table right now, or I'm taking your screen time away for an entire week.
As he suspected it would, the ultimatum did the trick. Brandon stopped mid-burble, processed the cost of not obeying, and promptly returned to his chicken and mashed potatoes.
Don't fret, kid,
Jacob told him.
That's the stuff we've been asking ourselves. Me personally, I'm betting on treasure, like in the Goonies.
Brandon smiled at that.
I like that one.
He switched his gaze to Miles.
Can I be there when you open it up tomorrow? My leg's doing okay.
Miles considered it as he sampled a drumstick. His gut, which still churned with echoes of the dread he had felt at the clearing, told him to keep the boy away from the hatch. His rational brain, however, told him to quit indulging irrational impulses and let the boy participate. It was just a stupid hatch, for God's sake.
Okay,
Miles said.
But no funny business. I say and you do. Got it?
Monkey here, monkey do,
Brandon confirmed.
That settles it,
Jacob announced.
We're all going.
Brandon clapped his hands.
We're all going.
Brandon had already brushed his teeth and gotten dressed when he came tugging on Miles' comforter at 8:15.
Dad,
he said excitedly, like it was Christmas morning.
Wake up so we can open the hatch.
Squinting at his alarm clock, Miles told the boy to go back to bed.
For an hour at least. 2 is better.
No way, Jose,
Brandon said, dancing around the bed like a maniac.
Wake up, wake up, wake up!
Knowing the boy wouldn't be dissuaded, Miles sat up and swallowed his annoyance.
Okay, you win. I'm up. Now go fix me a cup of coffee before I eat you.
Once he was showered and had a cup of coffee in him, Miles texted Jacob to see if he was awake. Jacob responded immediately, claiming he had been up since 6 and was raring to go. They met out front 10 minutes later and adjourned to the shed, where they procured a sledgehammer and Miles's heavy-duty bolt cutters.
Yeah,
Jacob said, admiring the cutters.
These should work just fine.
During the short jaunt out to the clearing, Miles marveled at how well Brandon's leg was holding up. He was barely limping and didn't seem to be in much pain.
How's it feeling?
He asked. Brandon gave him a thumbs up.
No problem. Todo es bueno.
All right, tough guy,
Miles said.
Let me know if anything changes.
When they reached a clearing, Brandon scampered over to the hatch and grabbed the hand wheel.
Wow, Dad, this is so cool. What if it's like a submarine or something?
Then we're all going to be famous, kid,
Jacob replied. He brought the bolt cutters to the hatch and looked back at Miles.
Want to do the honors, or shall I?
Miles motioned for Jacob to go ahead. The man beamed like an idiot and set the cutters on the locked shackle.
1, 2, 3,
he said, and clamped down hard. The cutters bit through the metal with ease, producing a loud, satisfying kink. A disoriented sense of deja vu came over Miles as he watched this unfold. He was sure he had seen something like this happen before, sometime in the past. Only it wasn't a lock that had been cut. It was a finger. His stomach churned with disgust and trepidation. He retreated a few steps, clutched his belly. He didn't want to see what came next. He didn't want to see what lay inside the tank. He wanted instead to run from this place, grab Brandon, and drive far, far away.
You okay, Dad?
Brandon said. Miles blinked at the boy.
Huh? No, Tommy's upset, that's all. Todo es bueno.
Jacob rattled the lock, turning it this way and that until it finally gave way.
Voila!
He said with glee, wrenching it off and chucking it into the underbrush. He turned to Brandon.
You're up, champ. See if you can turn it.
Brandon smiled and approached the hand wheel.
Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey?
You got it,
Jacob said. Brandon grabbed the wheel with both hands and tried to turn it. It didn't budge. He tried 3 more times without any luck.
I'm not strong enough.
Jacob moved in to help him.
Here, grab it again. I'll grab 2, and maybe the 2 of us can turn it.
They each gripped it tight and tried to turn. This time it turned, slowly at first. Then it spun with no issue. Jacob let Brandon finish turning it all the way. Once it stopped spinning, Jacob took over and pulled the hatch door completely open.
Good job, kid,
Jacob said, gently setting the hand wheel against the metallic structure's rusty surface.
Let me just have a peek, then you can look.
He dipped his face into the open porthole, but promptly withdrew it.
Way too dark down there. Good thing I brought this.
He fished a small tactical flashlight out of his pocket, flicked it on, and had another look. His head remained in the porthole for well over a minute.
What do you see?
Brandon inquired. Jacob pulled his head back out, his face ashen and somber. Brandon tried to have a look for himself, but Jacob stopped him.
Sorry, kiddo. No can do.
His eyes found Miles.
It's on your property, boss. You need to see.
Stomach churning even harder, Miles reluctantly advanced to the porthole's edge, grabbed Jacob's flashlight, and stuck his head inside. The flashlight revealed a puzzling and terrible sight. There were 6 rebar spikes, each about 4 feet tall, jutting up from the structure's bottom. Impaled on 5 of these spikes were 5 small corpses in various states of decay. The corpses of children, Miles realized. Tasting bile on his tongue, he yanked his head out of the porthole, dropped the flashlight, and stumbled backwards. After a few clumsy paces, he felt someone catch his arm. Jacob.
Easy there,
the man said.
Easy. Be strong for the boy.
Miles glanced at his son, who stood near the hatch, staring at it uncertainly.
We have to call the cops,
Jacob whispered.
But I didn't bring my cell.
Miles collected himself and patted his own pockets. They were empty. He'd left his phone on the kitchen counter.
Shit, me too. Keep an eye on Brandon for a minute. I'll be right back.
So saying, he bounded across the clearing towards the trail. "Will do," Jacob assured him. Back through the trees and into his backyard he sailed. Reaching his deck, he burst through the back door into the kitchen. The phone was there on the counter. He dialed 911, reported what they had found, and gave the responder his address. After killing the call, he scrabbled his way back to the clearing. About halfway to the woods, he heard Jacob cry out,
"Brandon, no! Stay out of there! Oh, God!"
The panic in his neighbor's voice sent a jolt of adrenaline through Miles' extremities, compelling him to sprint as fast as he could. He reached the clearing in seconds and found Jacob leaning over the hatch's portal.
"Jesus, kid,"
the man murmured.
"why'd you do that? What's happened?"
Miles yelled, snatching the flashlight from the ground and shoving Jacob out of the way.
"Brandon, where are you, pal? Answer me!"
After thrusting his head inside the porthole, it took a few moments for his brain to comprehend what he was looking at. His son, impaled through the heart on one of the rebar spikes, the one that hadn't previously held a corpse. The boy was facing upwards, as if he had somehow twisted as he fell, which didn't make any sense. His eyes were open, but devoid of life. Miles gasped. The world seemed to spin on its axis. He lurched backwards, falling onto his butt. Jacob stood over him, grimacing. No, not grimacing. Grinning. Why the hell was he grinning?
"It was quick, man,"
his neighbor said.
"Way too quick."
A rush of vomit shot up Miles' throat. He ejected in the grass next to him. The full weight of what had just happened struck him like a hammer to the chest. He'd lost the only thing he loved, his boy, whom he had cared for since the moment he was born. His child, who meant more to him than anything could possibly mean to anybody. His heart and soul.
"My Brandon,"
Miles whispered. Somewhere in the distance a bird screeched. The sound cut through the noise in his head, giving him a horrid sense of clarity. He clambered to his feet and trundled drunkenly back towards his house.
"Where are you going, Miles?"
Jacob shouted after him.
"We got some tidying up to do."
Barely registering the man's words, Miles retraced his steps to the house, tramped up to his bedroom, and grabbed his 12-gauge from its hiding spot in the closet. The all-consuming anguish he felt was too much to bear. He had to do something about it. He had to end it. He checked to make sure the gun was loaded, and returned once more to the clearing, where Jacob stood waiting for him, shovel in hand.
"We better get digging,"
his neighbor said. Miles cocked the shotgun and aimed it at the man.
"The fuck is wrong with you? My son is dead." "Rookie move, I know. Try to stick him through the belly, make it last longer so you could watch too. But I whiffed it, straight through the heart. Dead in seconds."
Before he could help it, Miles pulled the trigger and blew his neighbor's head in half. Jacob's body collapsed in a bloody heap. Oddly, he felt next to nothing about what he just did. His colossal grief seemed to drown out everything else. Letting it, Miles meandered to the hatch's portal and gazed down at his lifeless son. With the lack of light, he could barely see the boy's face, though he saw enough to discern his own failure as a father, and as a human being.
"Sorry, buddy,"
he cried, putting the shotgun's barrel under his chin.
"Don't worry. I'm going with you."
He pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. Just a click with no bang. He pulled the trigger 3 more times, with no effect.
"All right, Miles,"
he heard a voice say.
"That's good enough."
The voice seemed to come from everywhere rather than any specific direction.
"We can terminate now."
The entire scene around him seemed to undulate then, and Miles felt a fiery tickling sensation ripple across his skull. He shut his eyes involuntarily, and everything went black. When he tried to reopen them, the blackness remained.
Don't fight it.
The voice said.
A few more seconds and you'll be back.
A short eternity passed, and sure enough, things started to return. To his dismay, he found that he was no longer in the clearing, but in what appeared to be a small hospital room, seated on a light blue vinyl chair, the kind he associated with chemo patients receiving their life-prolonging poison. His clothes had been replaced with a hospital gown, and he noticed an IV had been inserted into his left arm.
What?
He groaned. Two large men in hospital scrubs appeared at his sides. One of them removed what felt like a helmet from his head, while the other slipped a sleep mask over his eyes.
Gentlemen,
the voice said,
please escort Mr. Freeman to Recovery Room 2.
One of the men did something to Miles's chair, and all at once he was moving. Following a jarring series of lefts and rights, his chair came to an abrupt halt. Soft fingers removed the mask from his eyes, and he watched as the two men exited his new room, a slender whitewashed chamber with no furnishings.
Okay.
A different voice said from the speaker mounted above the room's door.
Let us know when things start to return.
Miles was about to ask what the fuck was happening when a huge burst of memory flooded his thoughts, bringing it all back. His name was not Miles Freeman. It was Edmund Davis. He was neither an accountant nor a father. He did not live in Clay, New York. He lived in this unnamed facility ever since he had volunteered for the Capsule project.
I remember,
he said bitterly, the grief of losing Brandon still heavy in his heart.
Good,
the original voice said.
First, how real did it feel? Your life as Brandon's father, your interactions with others, your adopted history, all of it.
Edmund clenched his jaw.
Very real.
Elaborate,
the voice replied with a hint of malice. Every iota of Edmund's being hated answering these questions. But if he didn't answer, he would risk returning to Mohawk Correctional, where beatings and rape were a daily occurrence.
It felt like my actual life. I was a single parent, a loving dad.
And Brandon, you genuinely believed him to be your son?
Tears leaked from Edmund's eyes, a new sensation for him, one he didn't like.
Not believed, asshole. He was my son.
In reality, Brandon had been his second dalliance.
Excellent. And how does it feel now, after a little time has passed? Any fading of sensation?
Edmund sneered. He considered lying, but lying, like refusing to answer, was useless here. They had proven that to him in the control phase of testing.
No fading.
And how did it compare to your first session?
The voice asked. The first time he had been Celia Blaylock, Teddy Blaylock's mother. Teddy was his first dalliance, the boy he'd killed in the barn with the bees. No, not the barn, the shed. The barn was the fantasy they had constructed in the first session.
Realer,
he said.
More potent.
Continue.
The first session was more like a dream,
Edmund replied.
And I don't think I really accepted being a woman. This time was like a memory.
Interesting. Anything feel off about this scenario?
Edmund lowered his chin.
Jacob was taller in real life.
In reality, Jacob Winslow had been his killing partner, not neighbor. Prior to his suicide at Sing Sing, he had stood 6'3".
Anything else?
The voice inquired. Edmund stared at the speaker.
Yeah. What is it with the barn and the oil tank? It didn't actually happen that way.
You never remember that,
the voice said.
It's the mousetrap. We aren't permitted to replicate the actual murders, so we need a mousetrap. And you're helping us to build a better one each time.
Not permitted,
Edmund said.
So, all of this is legal?
That's a malleable word, Mr. Davis, but yes.
For what purpose? To torture people like me?
You never remember this either.
The voice replied, sounding amused.
No. To offer a third option, life sentence with no parole, execution, or the capsule.
And you think this isn't cruel and unusual punishment? What will I even be after the sessions? A vegetable?
Not for us to decide, and we shall see.
A spark of anger set off a cascade of fury inside Edmund, nearly as powerful as the soul-crushing sorrow he felt.
You really think this capsule bullshit will be used this way? In America?
Probably not. It's being tested for a myriad of uses besides what we're doing here. Any other questions or statements?
Yeah, fuck you.
Very well, Mr. Davis. You've had a long day. 12 hours in the capsule. Get some rest tonight and we'll revisit how you're feeling tomorrow. The day after, we'll conduct session 3, the Lopez child. Sound good?
Edmund didn't respond.
Splendid,
The voice said.
Also, it's adorable you think you're still in America.
Not a second later, the same two large men from before entered the room and got Edmund prepped for transport. As they wheeled him into the hallway, Edmund thought about Jacob and how smart his old friend had been to go out on his own terms, as he had. No such terms existed for Edmund. Not here at this facility, not with all the controls they had in place. For him, there was only the capsule, and the misery of dead children.
Tanya's mother drove at a steady but fast pace along the snowy, winding roads of Maryland, trying to edge off minutes from their hours-long trip back up north. She wouldn't dare tell her daughter she was that eager to drop her back off at St. Mary's. The short stint back home during Thanksgiving break was quite enough for her.
Ready to see your friends again, girlie?
Her mother hushed over the loud engine, breaking the awkward silence. Not really. I see them enough. I see them every single day, Tanya said slowly, without even looking up from the latest teenage pop culture magazine she'd purchased before the trip. Unlike you, she added quietly under her breath. Their relationship had been strained ever since Tanya's mother banished her away to the Catholic boarding school up in Pennsylvania 2 years prior. She assured Tanya that it was because she needed to focus on school, but it was really because she wanted to focus on her latest husband, one who was not very fond of Tanya's presence. Of course, she knew this, she felt this, so thus Tanya pushed away just as hard.
Can you believe it? We will see a new decade in a few weeks' time. I wonder what 1980s fashion will have in store for all of us. I hope we aren't all walking around in tarps and calling it haute couture.
Her mother chuckled. Tanya sighed with a slight annoyance as she flipped the page of her magazine. I doubt we will see that together, mother dear. I'm sure Walt will whisk you away to some tropical private island that nobody's ever heard of and leave me here to collect dust.
Okay, Tanya, I tried. I tried with you. I've been trying with you. I'll leave you to sit there with your attitude. Kids turn 13 and I swear the bad attitude comes along with it instantly. It's already enough that you ruined our Thanksgiving sitting around sulking, rolling those eyes around like they are dice.
Tanya sat still in the seat, tears beginning to well up in her brown eyes. She threw the magazine to the car floor and looked out of the passenger window, crossing her arms in a huff. Please just stop talking to me. You'll say anything to convince yourself that you aren't a terrible mother that gave her child away just to please some rich chump with bad breath. Her mother let out a slight laugh while tapping her fingers along the steering wheel.
Real mature, kiddo. So much for being a teenager now, huh? Look, Tanya, You may not like him, but we need him. And sometimes in life, you have to make choices that other people may not like. You won't understand it now, but you will appreciate it when you get older. You will understand when you have children of your own someday, someone to take care of or provide for. Things are not easy for me alone. So Walter is the one taking care of both of us, and it will stay that way. I won't ruin this one. Not for anyone, Tonya. Not for anyone.
They sat the rest of the 4-hour-long ride along the I-95 in a burning silence, both now in a terrible mood, not even bothering to glance over at each other in fear of starting another argument. Once Tonya could see the chapel turn school off into the distance, she sat up in relief. As much as she hated the place, she would rather be there than in the car with her mother. The entry parking lot was crowded and full of smog that stained the snow and off-white, misty air due to hordes of parents dropping their insufferable children back off for the end of the break. Tonya peeled the crowd for the slightest glimpse of someone she knew, but mostly for one of her 2 best friends who also went away during the break.
Do you need help with your bags?
Her mother said in a short tone, while looking at her nails and secretly hoping she would say no. So, when is the next time that I'll see you, Mother? A year? 2 years? 3 years? The year 1990? She said quietly.
Not sure, girlie. Can't promise you anything, especially with the way that you've been acting as of late. I think it's best that we spend time apart to cool off. This atmosphere isn't good for any of us.
I liked it better when it was just me and you, she interrupted. All of those times in between men, even the time after Dad, were those times all so bad? You actually spent time with me, and we did lots of things together. Why do you have to dump me off like this? Why do you always have to become a different person when you're with a new man? Her mother gripped the steering wheel and gleamed straight ahead, trying desperately to tune out her pleading child.
Goodbye, Tonya. I am not dealing with this right now. Call me if you need anything. Make it serious.
As if! Tonya yelled while slamming the passenger door shut. She snatched her things out of the back seats and began making her way to the crowded sidewalk. Sorry that I'm such a burden to you, she said while storming off, catching the attention of the people around her. She wiped tears and snow out of her eyes with one arm while lugging her bags with the other. Suddenly, she felt the weight from her right arm give.
Let me get this for you.
A familiar voice said from her right. Frankie took each bag in both hands and trotted alongside her, waiting for her to speak.
So, I guess I don't have to ask how your trip was?
He said through gritted teeth. Tonya cut her eyes at him as they both made their way across the campus and towards the girls' dormitory. The arms of the dead trees danced around the gray sky like vines. I hate her. She is such a narcissist, she cried. Frankie twisted his mouth in confusion for a while, but finally gave in to his curiosity.
What does that mean?
He said gently. Tonya slammed her eyes shut with irritation. Ugh! She cried while stomping away from him. Her pace began to slow as she saw a figure sitting on a stone bench next to a partially frozen fountain. The figure, cloaked in dark fabric, was visibly shaking, while 2 nuns tried to console them. The figure turned around after hearing the crunching of snowy steps halt behind them. It was Sam. She had stayed behind during Thanksgiving break, with no family willing to pick her up. Out of the 3 friends, she had been at St. Mary's the longest. It was rumored that she was an orphan taken in by the school in the early 60s, when they were still but a place of worship. But that wasn't quite true. Sam was the child of a heroin addict, one who had been taken away from her troubling background. Instead of being placed in the system, she was given away to the convent, then made to attend there after they turned into a private boarding school. Sam had distant family members, but none of them wanted anything to do with the addict's child. She was also a castaway, which was why she and Tanya got along so well. Her usually pale nose and cheeks, all that was visible beyond the dark abrasive fabric cloaked around her, were as red as a flame, being stung by the cold, wet air. She reached her nearly frostbitten hand towards her friend, who then ran by her side. Tanya kneeled down in the snow next to the bench, looking up at one of the nuns. "What's wrong, Sam? What happened?" she said frantically.
The other girls told us that she's been out here since last night. She hasn't said but a word. We have no idea.
She leaned forward and looked Sam directly in her blank eyes.
"Speak, child,"
the nun added, growing rather impatient. Frankie placed his hand on Sam's shoulder, but snatched it away just as quickly when he received a disapproving look from the other nun.
"Well, I should get going. I really should not be over here,"
he said while slowly placing down Tanya's other bag and backing away. Tanya ignored him and kept her focus on Sam, who was still shaking and staring blankly ahead.
"Let's get this girl back inside before she freezes to death. We all have class tomorrow,"
the impatient nun said under a cloud of condensation. Tanya grabbed her bags and walked beside Sam and the nuns, watching for any sign of a word. They made their way inside the entrance of the dormitory, and the nun stopped by the front door.
"Get her to bed quickly,"
the quieter nun said, before turning around, both leaving in a hurry. Tanya glanced back over at Sam, who was already making her way up the stairs at a snail's pace. Both bags in tow, she quickly caught up to Sam and nudged her with one of the bags. "Are you going to tell me what happened? Were you really sitting outside all night? You missed me that much, huh?" She laughed while trying to lighten the mood. Sam stared ahead as she weakly made her way up the last step, a single tear falling from her right eye. I made a mistake. I should have never gone out there," she whispered through a hoarse breath. "I mean, duh, silly. It must be 20 or so degrees outside, even colder during the night." "No!" she screamed while grabbing Tanya by both shoulders, the dark blanket slipping from her own shoulders and falling to the floor. The left side of her nightgown stained a rusty brown and smelling of iron. Tanya's eyes widened as she looked at the sight before her, then to a small group of girls a few feet away who began to giggle. "Golly, Sam, you didn't have any tampons on you?" she said while picking up her blanket and placing it back around Sam. "It's not mine. It's not my blood, Tanya," she said through a sudden sob. Beginning to feel embarrassed, Tanya looked away and scratched her curly black hair, taking a few steps away from Sam and reclaiming her bags. She rushed past the group of judgmental girls who blurted "wacko" towards her, but meant more for Sam. She grabbed the stained brass doorknob to her room and opened it profusely, almost throwing her bags inside and then quickly making her way back to Sam, who was standing alone and still sobbing. "Sam, please stop. You're embarrassing us. Let's get you to your room first, okay?" she quietly pleaded near Sam's ear. She slowly nodded yes, and Tanya grabbed her wrist with an iron grip and marched right back past the group of girls, opening Sam's dorm room, which was located across the hall from hers. She peeked her head out of the door and yelled, "Shove it!" while displaying her tiny middle finger. One of the girls scoffed before she slammed the door shut. "What the hell, Sam? You have those girls laughing at us. They're going to tell everyone tomorrow," she whined while stomping. "They ate her. Sister Ruth. Tanya, they ripped her heart out with their bare hands." Tanya threw her arms into the air and plopped herself into a chair near Sam's side of the room. "Sam, we are teenagers now. No more little kid campfire stories. Get a grip." Sam suddenly rushed over and pounced on Tanya, knocking the chair backwards and both of them onto the floor. I'm not lying. I first saw them Wednesday night, after everyone left, and then they killed Sister Ruth Saturday night. I saw it all. The blood. The blood. They know that I saw. They've been following me ever since. Stay silent, keep still, she said frantically, while violently shaking Tanya by the shoulders. Get off of me! You're scaring me! She said with wide eyes, looking up at Sam in fear while her matted, mousy brown hair dangled across her face. Please, just get off of me and go shower! Lay down and stop being a creeper! She huffed. She pushed Sam away and awkwardly stood up from the fallen chair. She quickly made her way to the door, turning around once more to Sam, who was still kneeling on the floor, rocking back and forth. Look, I'll see you tomorrow during Mass, okay? I just cannot deal with all of this right now. I have my own problems, she said pleadingly. She slowly closed the door and walked across the hallway without looking back, feeling slightly like a terrible friend, and also slightly feeling relieved to be out of the situation. The hallway was now eerily quiet and rather empty. There was no way to tell the time of day by looking outside, but the sky was a blank electric blue, telling her that it was definitely late evening or nighttime. The group of girls had disappeared, just one or two girls down below in the commons room, sitting quietly and minding their own business. Tanya gathered fresh clothes from her room and made her way to the shower, only thinking about the moment she could lay in bed and forget about the agonizing week prior. To forget about Walter, to forget about her mother, to forget about Sam, to forget about how she couldn't sleep in the next morning, to forget about how she wanted to see Silent scream at the movies, but Walt forced them to stay home and watch The Little House Years and eat her mother's incredibly dry turkey, because Tanya was still a little kid and too young for that movie. She wanted to melt all of her stress away like spring snow, melt into the stiff mattress in her dorm, and focus on nothing but herself for a while. The snores from her roommates made her sit upright in her bed, grabbing a handful of her curls in each hand in frustration. Contemplating banging her head against the wall, Tanya grabbed her clock and slammed it back down after she traced the slender arms in the dark, feeling as though they mockingly pointed out 3:18 a.m. She threw the duvet off of her, slipping on a pair of too small shoes she hid conveniently under her bed, and slowly made her way to the window. The girls' dorm was at the furthest northern reach of campus ground, purposely built that far away to deter curious boys from venturing to that restricted area. Tanya's room was against the west wing, which looked off into a centuries-old graveyard built before the tree line of the dark Pennsylvania wilderness. Many of the girls joked about ghouls or ghosts, which was off limits to say unless the word holy came before it, living in the graveyard. But she knew it was nonsense. She leaned forward and blew her hot breath against the cold glass until it condensed, writing the words, "St. Mary sucks," before it slowly disappeared into the glass. While the words went away as quickly as they came, something else caught her eye. The tree line appeared to dance in her peripheral vision. She focused her eyes past the graveyard, squinting through the flurries of snow that fell like weights from the chrome-colored sky. A small, brightly dim light gray circle bloomed from around the dark bark of the forest, then another, then two more, then four more, until there was a group of 10 floating circles amongst the dark. Tanya quickly realized that they were not floating gray circles, but faces. Faces with bodies that were cloaked in a dark robe, a rich maroon color. She shrugged it off as wayward girls who snuck out of the dorms to go play in the woods. She crossed her arms before her, contemplating telling one of the sisters since she had nothing else better to do, until she realized that one of the heads seemed to lack hair. Tanya knew of almost everyone at school, and none of the girls were bald. That was right before she realized that all of the heads were bald. What the hell? She said to herself in confusion. Maybe they're adults? She thought, but she couldn't let it go. She also wanted to make sure she wasn't losing her mind, that the lack of sleep was not causing her to see things that were not there. She quietly opened her door and snuck across the creaking wooden hallway floor to Sam's door. There was always at least one nun on duty downstairs, making sure nobody came in or out during the night, and Tanya did not want to catch her attention. She opened the door as gently as possible to ensure she didn't wake Sam's roommate. "Sam? Sam!" she loudly whispered. She stood still when she saw that Sam was already awake, holding her legs close to her chest and rocking back and forth in bed. "Shh! They will find me!" Sam moaned out loud, her eyes bloodshot from the constant crying. "People in red cloaks?" Tanya said while sitting next to her. Sam immediately stopped rocking and darted her eyes past Tanya and towards the doorway. "You saw them too!" "They ate Sister Ruth," she said in a monotone voice.
"Will you shut your mouth, Psycho Sammy?"
One of her older roommates blurted from her sleep.
"Will you please shut her up? She's been going on and on all night. The rest of us are trying to sleep, and we have to be up in 4 hours,"
she added, while slowly sitting up and redirecting her anger towards Tanya. "All right, Megan, please just calm down before one of the sisters come up," Tanya whispered. She grabbed Sam by the arm and forced her off the bed. "You're coming to my room, okay?" It was then that Tanya realized that she still had on the same bloodstained nightgown from earlier. She never even changed clothes. She sighed in disgust and led her out of the room. They made their way across the hall right before a bright light shined upon them. Sister Elizabeth stood at the turn of the stairs with one hand on her hip and the other holding a flashlight.
"And what exactly is going on here?"
she said in her husky voice. Tanya, using her left arm to stop the blinding light from burning her pupils, was frozen in fear, not knowing what to say. Sam suddenly gasped, snatched her arm out of Tanya's grip, and fell back onto the floor behind her. Suddenly, a gray face grew from behind Sister Elizabeth. She did not turn to look behind her. Instead, her old voice let out a dull groan while her eyes rolled to the back of her head. What little bit of neck shone on the elderly woman slowly bulged forward as if she swallowed an apple whole. It pushed and prodded right before a speck of red peered through, splitting further apart and revealing what was a fingernail and flesh, and then 3 fingers. Blood now splattering on the floor and pouring out from her eyes, she lunged forward, expressing a whole hand straight through her wide neck. The figure emerged from behind Sister Elizabeth's dark habit, slowly extending its body to full length. Standing 7 feet tall at the least, it smiled a sharp, yellow, blood-stained grin. Its bare gray head gleamed in the dim hallway light. The blood from the nun's neck spouted onto its dark red cloak and immediately disappeared. With his hand still impaled through her neck, he lifted his arm and dangled Sister Elizabeth by the throat. Tanya let out a scream loud enough to wake the entire school before turning to her left and finding Sam gone. She furiously turned the doorknob to her room to no avail. She kicked on the rotting wood of the door, pleading for someone to open it. "Sam, stop holding the door shut and let me in!" she cried. She glanced back over at the tall figure, still smiling as the nun's dangling body began to spasm ferociously. He made a bloody fist out of his pale, lengthy fingers and swung the nun's body around as if she were a flag. I can't, Sam said frantically from behind the safety of the door. "He will get me! They will get me! I can't open the door. Tanya wasted not a single second more. She began to bang on the door across the hall. Megan swung the door open with anger. She was puzzled to find it was Tanya banging on the door instead of Sam. She cut her eyes over the levitating nun, and they quickly widened. The figure loosened his fist into a straight point. He threw out his arm, which sent the nun flying out from his wrist. Megan let out a faint scream before the now-dead nun's heavy body collapsed on top of her, causing them both to fall back into the room. Tanya pushed her way inside of the room, kicking the nun's limp legs from out of the doorway so it would close.
Get up and help me!
She cried to Megan as she fiddled with the door. The girl struggled to free herself from the nun's paralyzing restraint, dragging herself out from under her. She stood up and pulled on the nun's arm to make room. Tanya put all of her weight into her shoulders, tackling the door repeatedly with all her might.
Hurry up!
She pleaded. The other two girls in the room were beginning to waken, slowly sitting up in confusion. It was then that the door flew open, knocking Tanya to the ground. She fell beside the nun and immediately crawled backwards, trying to get away from the thing. The girls began screaming as their eyes fell upon the bare, brightly dim face of the thing. His eyes were completely black, as if they were fresh coals mined from the earth. His skin, slick with grease, shed the most putrid smell imaginable, like a decaying possum on the side of the road. He placed his long, bloody finger in front of his thin lips, all while keeping that devilish grin. As he signaled for the girl's silence, he knelt down and picked up Sister Elizabeth's body.
I earned it. I keep it,
he said in a short, raspy tone as he lifted her body with one arm and hoisted it over his skinny, broad shoulder. One of the bedbound girls fainted and fell back into the sheets. The other covered her face in terror. The creature pointed to Tanya with its long black nails.
I never forget a face,
he said with a calming smile.
And we never miss a meal. So stay silent and keep still.
He slowly backed out of the doorway, keeping a sharp and jagged smile. He turned to Tanya's doorway and stood still for a few seconds. Then he leaned forward, placing his open, bloody palm upon the door, and whispered the words.
You didn't stay silent. Now you will be our meal.
Sam let out a muffled shriek from behind the door. The thing made its way to the stairs and disappeared back into the dark. Tanya's breathing grew heavy as she stared at the long, bloody handprint on her door. She suddenly felt a jolt through her chest and a pain inside of her head. She lost her vision and passed out on the cold wooden floor, hitting her head with a slam on the way down.
Hey, wake up. Please wake up.
A voice said from beyond the fog of her thoughts. Her eyelids slowly retracted, the faint morning light of the now clear sky partially blinding her. She pushed herself up with her hands, looking around frantically. Chunks of congealed blood sat under her palms and caused her grip to slip. Megan, who was leaning over her, helped her to her feet. One of the girls from the night before was packing her bags. She had gone to the front office at the break of dawn to call her mother. She was leaving the school, for good. The other roommate was nowhere to be seen.
Your roommates told the sisters about Sam. They've been trying to get her out of your room all morning. Some of the sisters are convinced that she's possessed.
Megan paused. She glanced up at the girl frantically packing her things, then back at Tanya and whispered.
They want to get rid of her and get her out of the school. But we saw what she saw. We know.
We know nothing. I know nothing. I didn't see a thing, Tanya exclaimed as she brought her bloody hands to her ears to drown out the words being spoken. It was not a dream. It wasn't even a nightmare. Tanya now knew. She knew why Sam was inconsolable, and now she believed.
As much as I don't like Sam, We can't.
Tanya slammed her foot to the ground and grabbed her forcefully by her slouching shoulder. Stay silent, remember? Tanya hissed. She pushed her way past Megan and left the room to find a crowd around her doorway. She quickly cut her eyes at the dried, bloody handprint smacked right in the middle of the old, dark wood. Please move! This is my room! She said while shoving her way through nosy girls and curious nuns. Sam was screaming and flailing around like a snared animal while being held down by 2 nuns. Father Nicholas stood above her. He was sweating profusely, perplexed at what decision to make next while 3 other nuns barraged him with suggestions.
Don't touch her. The demon we spread.
One of the standing nuns whispered to him. She's not possessed. She's just sick. Tanya interrupted. The eyes around the room all glanced over at her.
Where did this blood on her gown come from? Has anyone seen Sister Elizabeth? She was supposed to be keeping watch throughout the night.
She's dead! They're coming for me next, then you will all be dead! Said Sam with eyes wider than the sky. The nun, previously rubbing her arms hastily, made her way to Sam and slapped her clear across the face.
Nonsense. You will stop this at once. Mass is in less than an hour. Get yourself together, put your uniform on, and get yourself downstairs before you earn the paddle.
Sister Meredith, you know we're not allowed to do that anymore.
Interrupted a younger nun. The older nun turned to her in a fury, and the younger one immediately looked away.
And who'll stop me? Her mother? The addict? The junkie that left her out on the street right in front of the steps of our chapel? This is why she's the way she is. That poison tainted her spirit.
She stormed back over, pushed the struggling nuns away, and snatched Sam up by one arm. She let out a scream as she was pulled by the arm, her shoulder burning at the socket. I hope you're next! Sam barked at Sister Meredith as she struggled against her grasp. She reached out to Tanya with the other arm, who was turning beet red in the face. Stay silent, Tanya! She recalled while her and the nun left the room.
All right, everyone out!
Father Nicholas yelled while making a sweeping motion with his arms.
Everyone should be on time today. Show up to all of your classes.
He took out a handkerchief and wiped sweat from his wrinkled forehead.
Are you all right, Father?
One of the nuns said while rushing over to him. He immediately scanned the room for Tanya, who tried to hurry out with the crowd. He caught up to her and stood in the doorway.
You, come to my office, immediately.
He glanced at the dried print on the outside of the door before attempting to wipe it off with his sweaty handkerchief. Tanya nodded and followed the man down the stairs. Keep still. The sinister but sing-songy voice of the thing repeated in her head like a tape recorder. Tanya's shorter legs had trouble keeping up with the fast-paced trot the priest had set before her. Every now and again, he would take a quick glance back at her to make sure she trailed behind, never once mentioning a word until they made it across the campus and directly in front of his office door. He gestured aggressively for her to enter, commanding her to sit before she was through the doorway. Tanya slowly sunk into the chair and sat awkwardly with a slouch. She knew that if her mother could witness her posture, she'd be sure to get an awful pinch and be told to sit up straight. The sudden onslaught of the thought caused her to extend her back as straight as she possibly could, gaining confidence to confront the father with lies. "What am I here for? I don't know anything," she said while pretending to be inconvenienced.
Why did the girl say that to you? Stay silent. Stay silent about what exactly? You are well aware that it is a sin to lie. Therefore, I expect to get the absolute truth out of you.
The room went silent. Tanya wasn't a very religious person, but since her time at St. Mary's, she'd start to become wary of breaking biblical rules. Out of fear, of course. She averted her gaze away from Father Nicholas and towards an old, frost-glazed window sitting a few feet above his head.
Speak, child.
The father interrupted as he slammed his hand against the desk. She jumped immediately and slammed her eyes shut to avoid the stressor before her. Tanya slowly opened her eyes again, this time staring at him. He has one eyebrow raised while anticipating her response, the sweat on his forehead finally starting to evaporate into nothingness. She saw something swaying faintly behind Father Nicholas at the window. Something long, something sharp, something a pale gray. Everything inside of Tanya told her not to look up, but she could not help it. She needed to know if what she felt that she may be seeing was actually what was there. The color in her face drained immediately when she finally dared herself to look up. Two dark voids of nothingness planted behind the window before her. The lack of color within them made it seem as if it was staring everywhere, all at once. Those sharp, buttery yellow teeth widened into a grin, its finger wagging to and fro, signaling to her, no, no, no. The disapproving finger brought her back to reality. She averted her gaze from the thing to avoid directing any attention towards it. Nothing. Like I said, Sam is sick. She's been sick for days. How do you think she feels, having to sit here all weekend with no family to come for her? She's just lashing out. She's always been melodramatic like that. She's hurt. Father Nicholas paused, then took a deep breath. He looked down and picked up a rusty pen from the top of the desk and began to twirl it around his fingers. Tanya took this moment to look back at the window. She huffed a sigh of relief to find it empty. Nothing but flurries of snow scattered around the pane of the glass.
I believe that you and this student are pulling some sort of practical joke or prank. It's nonsense. I will have to call your mother about this.
Let go of me, you old hag! You're gonna get me killed! Sam cried while hammering Sister Meredith's hand with her small fist.
You will not make a mockery of this institution. You will behave yourself. God will see to it.
The nun growled through gritted teeth. She dragged Sam through the corridors of the school, still strewn in her putrid-stained nightgown. Glances and gasps scattered around the spectacle as they made their way across campus and towards a dark, dank basement. Sister Meredith fiddled with the locks impatiently as Sam fought against her, kicking and twisting around. She threw the door open and pulled the child down the stairs behind her as if she were toting a heavy sack of spuds. She threw the girl down at the base of the wooden steps. The nun dusted her habit in various places, frowning at the mess the altercation made of her usually neat appearance.
You will stay down here until you repent. I won't have you influencing the minds of your peers with your immorality,
she said while swiping at the brown powder on her black fabric.
You didn't stay silent. Now you will be our meal.
A voice whispered from the black voids of the basement. The nun froze immediately, thinking that her stillness would help her focus on what she heard. Her eyes shot out at Sam, who was cowering in the corner against the cold stone wall.
What did you say?
She yelled aggressively. It wasn't me! Sam gasped. The basement door at the top of the steps slammed shut. The sound of chuckles rang around the dark, musty air, varying in tone and pitch. Sister Meredith cried out in fear and began running up the wooden planks. A ghastly gray hand emerged from the space between them, grabbing her ankle and pulling it forward, snapping the bones in one swift motion. The ear-piercing scream made Sam protect her head with her arms. The nun cried. She dug her finger into the splintering wood, trying to make it up to the door while exposed bone drug along the abrasive steps. Her struggling hand grasped a smooth leather material, causing her to grow silent and look out into the darkness before her. The nun made it out to be a shoe.
Please, help me, Father,
she pleaded. The shoe tore away from the feeble hand, and stomped on it with force. More laughs rung around the room, encouraging the spectacle. The glimmers of a dozen or so pupils glittered the darkness in various colors, as if Fireless had made the old basement their home.
Now you will be our meal.
Loud, demonic shrieks rang in the air, and Sam felt gusts of wind breeze by her and stampede towards the helpless woman lying on the stairwell. The sound of screaming, tearing fabric, and flesh squelching between fingers made her shake uncontrollably, still covering her head. Splatters of blood rained upon her in the darkness, coating her in a fresh layer of blood. The screaming finally stopped, but the feasting did not. Sam was too afraid to look up from behind the shield of her rather helpless arms. A hand gently placed itself on top of hers.
Please, I'll keep still. I will stay silent. I promise this time I will.
She cried without looking. The grip of the hand tightened around hers and flung her arm from the position. Too late. Now they know. We are revealed. Once you're all dead, we will go. Tanya hung her head low while trying to drown out the sound of her mother's harsh words.
You really just had to pull a stunt like this. Are you aware of how much it costs to send you to that damn school every year? I get that you want attention, Tanya, but this isn't it.
But Mother, it's not. You don't understand, she pleaded.
I can't tell you over the phone, okay?
She whispered.
Suspension. God, I cannot believe that you managed to get yourself suspended from a Catholic school, Tanya. Walt is gonna be so pissed.
I don't care about Walt, Mother!
Yeah, I can see that. Now, I have to make the drive all the way back up there. Gasoline is going up, but of course, you wouldn't care about that, you spoiled brat. I'm so disappointed in you. I am not dealing with you today. I will be there tomorrow morning. They can figure out what to do with you until then.
Mother, please, wait!
A click ended the line, and silence filled Tanya's ears. She slammed the handset into the rotary phone 3 times, making the dial jump with an eerie tune.
That's enough. Now, you've already missed Mass, but you are not exempt from your classes today. Each teacher will give you a set of assignments to complete upon your week away. Do not think that this is some sort of holiday. You will be expected to finish everything given to you by your return next week, or you will face harsh consequences. I also expect you to pray every single day, asking forgiveness for your foolishness. I will ask your mother if these duties were met. Understood, child?
Tanya fought back tears and looked Father Nicholas in his green eyes. I am not a child. She stood up in a huff and snatched his office door open. She stomped across campus, ignoring all of the grins and waves that came her way. Suddenly, a hand wrapped itself around her right wrist, causing her to release a blood-curdling scream.
Whoa, Tanya, cool out,
Frankie said, putting both hands up in embarrassment. She was relieved to see it was human. It was just Frankie. Relieved, she slouched down, placing her hands on her knees.
What has been going on with you? I've been hearing things about you. And Sam.
I am suspended. Somehow I got suspended because Sam wanted to spaz out.
She chuckled while still bending over, knowing that she was only telling a half-truth.
Something about Sam screaming that we're all gonna die?
Frankie, please just shut it, okay? Just stop and let it go.
She began to walk away from him, hoping that he would go on about his day.
But why can't I know? You guys never fill me in on anything, always keeping things from me. And what's with the fake blood all over your hands? Pulling a cool prank and not even letting me tag along really sucks, you know? Or is that like lady stuff, because that is so gross.
Tanya rolled her eyes, growing frustrated as he followed her across campus like a lost puppy. She turned him out to the best of her abilities, allowing him to talk to himself. She wanted to answer his questions, but she knew that she shouldn't. She would not dare. She scanned the top of the building around her, feeling as if there were a set of opals for eyes watching her every move. Always watching. A gust of wind made her shiver in her pajamas. She hastened the pace to a small trot to get away from the stinging cold. The first period bells rang by the time she made it to the entrance of the girls' dormitory. She turned behind her to see absolutely nothing. Tanya felt slightly bummed and mostly concerned that Frankie was long gone and no longer talking to the back of her head. She hadn't even noticed that he had left her minutes ago. Actually, the whole campus was eerily quiet. So very still. Not even the faintest hint of a student, nun, or teacher outside around her. The uncomfortable atmosphere grew too much, and she ran inside and up the stairs of the dorm. What is happening to me? She thought out loud. She was about to go right back home to Maryland, almost as quickly as she left. She tried to weigh the pros and cons in her head. Thank God I can get away from those things. Get away from this place. But those things... what if they follow me? What if they... She turned the old doorknob to her empty room and made her way to her bed. She began to make it up in her mind that she would spend the whole week back home, begging and pleading with her mother to transfer her over to a new school, back to an even crappier public school. May as well pack all of my bags then, because I won't be coming back here, that's for sure, she said definitively. She braced her hands against her bed and placed her feet underneath it, trying to take off each shoe with the other foot. The toe of her left shoe hit against something, which confused her. Tanya never kept anything beneath her bed, except for the old pair of shoes that she still had on. She figured that one of the many onlookers from earlier may have left something under her bed when they invaded her room. She casually crouched down and lifted the dingy white skirt bordering her mattress. Tanya still saw absolute darkness underneath the bed, so she stuck her hand out rather quickly to grab for the object instead. She felt around in the dark, and suddenly her finger got caught in a web of strands. She grabbed the foreign object and gently pulled it, realizing it was rather heavy. Horror isn't even the best word to describe what she felt as she held the severed head of Sam by the tangled, mousy brown strands of her hair. The head hit the wooden floor with a thud. She stumbled back until she could feel the doors of her wardrobe hit her backside. Absolutely stricken with fear, Tanya did not know whether to cry for her dearly departed friend or cry because she may very well be next. There was no way she could stay there another day. She darted out of her door and ran down the hall and stairs so quickly that she almost tumbled down them. She stood outside the entrance of the dormitory, looking around frantically for any sign of authority.
Help! Help me!
She sobbed. A nun walked out of the building across from her and yelled to her from a distance.
What is the matter? Why are you screaming like a lunatic? Why aren't you dressed and in class?
She ran over and grabbed the nun by the hand. She wasted no time forcefully guiding the nun back inside, back up the stairs, and into her dorm room.
Look! It's Sam!
She pointed. The nun snatched her arm out of Tanya's grip and pulled her by the ear.
What kind of games are you playing? There is nothing here.
Tanya shook her head in disbelief. She knew what she saw because she held it in her very hands. She swiped the woman's hand away and paced around the room.
No, it was right there. Sam's head was under my bed.
But the head was gone. Not a trace of it anywhere around the room, not even a speck of blood. She knew she was not just imagining things, Something had come into her room right after she left. Tanya filled with rage, realizing that they were toying with her. She clasped her hands over her mouth immediately. "Stay silent," she reminded herself right at the nick of time.
I am telling Father Nicholas of this. You and your friend have caused enough trouble today.
Tanya threw up her hands and shrugged at the nun.
Go ahead, tell him. I want to leave now. Not tomorrow, now.
Usually the dormitory telephone was off limits during school hours and was locked in a glass encasing that only the faculty had access to. Feeling desperate, she knew that she had to call her mother back by any means necessary.
Young lady?
Let me use the telephone. If you don't, I swear I'll tell everyone that you people abuse me. I'll even tell the local news, I swear.
She threatened. The nun felt concerned, and she knew that Tanya meant every word by how frantically she was shaking.
You devilish child.
She promptly turned and left the room. Tanya followed. Rather expeditiously, they walked down the stairs of the dorm. The nun scowled at Tanya, then pulled a key out of her pocket and proceeded to unlock the glass container. She wasted no time picking up the handset and dialing her mother's number. It rang for a few seconds. Then she heard the familiar voice over the line.
Yes, hello?
Her mother said impatiently.
Mother, please, just listen.
What is it now, Tanya? What have you done?
Her eyes glazed over her surroundings. The nun slapped her index finger on an empty spot on her wrist. Tanya knew that she needed to be careful about what she would say next.
Please, come get me now. I don't want to wait until tomorrow.
It's not about what you want, Tanya. That is what you're always failing to realize.
Tanya tried to hold back tears. The panic and frustration was beginning to be too much for her to handle.
But you told me to call you if I needed anything serious. This is it. Mother, this is serious. Please just come get me.
The conversation went quiet for a few seconds before her mother let out a sigh.
Look, I am busy right now. Walter and his driver agreed to come get you tomorrow. I think it's best that you two spend a little time together anyways. A 4-hour drive would be perfect for that.
I don't care as long as it's today, and I don't want to come back here, Mother.
She heard her mother ask Walter a few questions in the background. Then she spoke directly to her.
You are lucky that he has a free schedule today, Tanya. They agreed to leave now. You need to be ready as soon as he gets there, though. He doesn't have time to wait around for you.
A sigh of relief escaped her voice.
Thanks, Mother.
The line ended without another word. She could care less that her mother was inconvenienced or upset by her demands, but she knew that they were very much necessary. The hardest part now was behind her. Tanya no longer had to wait until tomorrow. She could possibly be gone by the afternoon.
Don't you think that Father Nicholas won't hear about this? Now, go get dressed and get to class until your parents get here. Oh, they'll have a talking to about your behavior,
she said as she slammed the case shut and fiddled with the key. Tanya ignored her and ran right up to her room to shower and pack her bags. She turned that old crusty knob of her door, one that she was praying she'd never see again. Fear struck her like the plague as she saw a figure cloaked in an ancient maroon fabric facing her window.
Close the door,
it said in the softest, sinister voice.
I didn't say anything.
I know. But you owe us something. Give it to us, and we shall go.
I don't owe you anything. You already killed my friend.
We need to feed. One last meal. One last feast. We need one to kill,
it said. Tanya gained a few ounces of courage and took one step closer to the thing.
What are you?
We are older than time itself. and we will remain even after that. As long as we feed.
But please, why me?
I'll let you go. I'll let you leave. Find me one more way to feed.
Tanya noticed that the thing said I'll and not will. She knew that this thing was the ringleader of the pack. Negotiation was futile, but it was possible. Where? How? She asked rhetorically, knowing that it was for her to figure out on her own. Tanya knew that if she didn't appease the beast, it would not leave her alone. She stared at its bare head in disgust. Never did she think it was possible that skin could be so bright, yet so dim at the very same time.
Just stay silent and keep still.
It hushed. She knew what it wanted. It was either going to be her or someone else. The task before her struck her with uncertainty and fear. For the first time since her birthday, she finally had an adult decision to make. Tanya closed her eyes, shivered with the thought of completing the task ahead of her. She slowly opened her eyes back to a now empty room. She began to cry as she put her uniform on and finished packing. She placed them nestled behind her room door and made her exit. She left the dorm and slowly made her way to her first period class, which was more than halfway over at this point. Tanya began brainstorming and concluding while she packed, so she already had a solution to her problem. It is an unforgivable act, but sometimes in life, you have to make choices that other people may not like. She knocked on the classroom door loudly. Then the door swung open mid-knock.
You're late. Very late, Miss Tanya. You still will be counted as absent.
A male teacher said while fiddling with a small piece of chalk in his right hand and nodding his head sarcastically. Whatever, she said under her breath. The only seat available was one right in front of the class, in front of the chalkboard. She was now forced to sit in the only seat that nobody ever wanted. Eyes and whispers from students behind her pondered her every movement. The teacher walked over to her in a pair of raggedy old loafers and smacked a stack of papers on her desk.
For your little trip away,
he said with a facetious smile. She rolled her eyes, and suddenly, the bell rang. She was the first one up and out of the door. She ran into the corridor and scanned the crowd until she saw Frankie and waved for him to come over. He shuffled over with a smile, genuinely happy to see his friend.
Hey, Tanya, are you going to be in second period?
He said, nudging her with his elbow. She avoided eye contact with him. Tanya grabbed his hand and led him away from the crowd of students. Can you come with me, please? There's something that I wanted to show you.
I mean, we have 15 minutes before our next class, so why not?
He shrugged. Tanya kept a hold of his hand, which made Frankie feel slightly special inside. He always had a crush on her, but he wouldn't dare make any mention of it.
Where exactly are we going?
She ignored him and continued to lead him further and further away, towards the northern end of campus. They passed the girls' dormitory and made their way westward until Tanya could see the tree line in the distance. All of the students knew that the older, naughty kids snuck back there to do things, and this made Frankie feel uncertain.
Tanya, why are we going to the woods? This part is off limits.
She convinced herself that if she didn't respond to his inquiries, it would make it a little less real and a little more humane. They walked until the tree line was about 25 feet away. Then Frankie removed himself from her grip.
Look, Tanya, I really don't want to go back there, okay? You may think I'm a chicken or something for it, but I don't like this.
She swung around impatiently and shook her hands in the air out of frustration, Just trust me, okay? She tried to ignore the anxiety in his face, knowing that it would only make it harder for her. Come on, Frankie. Do it for me? She said with a disingenuous smile. He nodded and slowly took a few steps through the snow. He tried to ignore his soaking wet socks in order to please his dear friend. Once the trees were at an arm's reach, she stopped once more. Go inside, she pointed. Tears began to well up in his eyes.
Tanya,
I'm here! I did what you asked! She yelled out into the trees ahead.
Who are you talking to?
He cried. Will you just shut up and go in there? She said impatiently. She finally turned back around to her friend, a crying, shivering, terrified boy. Frankie was the epitome of innocence. Regret instantly filled Tanya to her core. She scanned the tree line frantically, then turned back to him. She shut her eyes out of shame and let out a sigh. Just go, Frankie, she said reluctantly. He looked down at the white ground beneath him. He felt terrible that he was not tough enough to endure whatever task she had planned for him.
I'm sorry, Tanya.
Go, Frankie! Get out of here! Hurry! Run! She screamed while shoving him. He staggered back slightly, then caught his balance and scurried away. Once he was far enough away, she turned back towards the tree line. She scanned her surroundings and took a few steps back, afraid that she had angered something. Give me more time. I'll find someone else, I promise, she said with uncertainty. Tanya backed slowly away from the tree line, refusing to turn her back to it. Once the individual trees turned into one dark mass from the distance, she turned and ran back towards the civilization of her campus. She could hear the late bell ringing in the distance, which made her hasten the pace. Her initial plan had failed. She had already lost one friend. She did not want to be complicit in sacrificing another. But of course, this meant that she was now putting herself at great risk. She thought about using Megan for her task, but Megan was already privy to the events that occurred the night prior and would most likely be onto her scheme. She needed to find someone that was unsuspecting, someone that no one would miss. She trekked across the snow to her second period class, which happened to be English. Tanya grabbed the handle before it could be locked and pushed her way inside.
Still late,
a nun said while glancing at her over brown spectacles. Sorry. The other students were still settling down, gossiping and bragging about irrelevant things. Frankie was the only sign of stillness within the rambunctious classroom, sitting alone in the back corner. He could feel her staring his way and refused to make eye contact with her. She walked over and kneeled next to his desk. Me and Sam are leaving after today. We got expelled for that prank, you know, she said solemnly. He subtly glanced at her through his peripheral vision. They sent her away already, and now my stepfather is on his way to pick me up. I'm sorry that I didn't tell you sooner. I knew you'd be crushed. I don't think we'll ever see each other again, but you'll always be my friend. One of the best ones, she whispered. He turned to her, but by then she was already walking to an empty seat nearby. She could not bring herself to look at him again. She had almost betrayed the only person left who cared greatly for her. The instructor clapped her hands together twice and pointed to the chalkboard.
Silence, everyone. Now, open your textbooks to page 274.
Tanya took a look at the black clock planted on the wall above the door. She only had to wait about another hour for her way out. She completely turned the nun out, not hearing a single word, only noticing every once in a while that she would make a gesture towards the board with a ruler. Tanya placed herself on autopilot and forced herself to complete whatever task was given to her for the rest of the period. This was the home stretch, she said to herself. Moments later, the bell finally rang, and everyone stood up in a hurry. The nun scurried past students and to her desk, then made her way towards Tanya. She handed her a slip of paper that had instructions for a paper that she was expected to write during her week suspension. Tanya read it, crumbled the paper in her hands, and tossed it on the ground. "As if," she said. The nun scoffed at her as she walked away. She smiled as she saw Frankie waiting for her outside. He gave a slight grin back, but raised an eyebrow.
Is this really the last time I'll ever see you, Tanya?
"Quit spazzing. You have the house number," she joked while desperately trying to lighten the mood. The truth was, Tanya had no idea if anyone would ever see her again. She still had not fulfilled her end of the bargain, and it was almost time for her to leave. She knew without even asking that those things would not forget. They would probably follow her anywhere that she went. The thought of it made her regret saving Frankie for a split second, but she fought the doubt away.
But it won't be the same with you and Sam gone. Write me letters, or actually maybe you could visit me once in a while. What was that thing about earlier, near the woods? Because I was getting pretty spooked.
Like clockwork, she tuned out the sound of her dear Frankie and his continuous ramblings. Tanya quietly observed the crowd for anyone who would be the most perfect, unsuspecting prey. Someone with no friends, no appeal. Someone deemed conventionally unattractive. Someone who, in her eyes, had zero relevance. Suddenly, her concentration was broken by Father Nicholas.
"Tanya, your father is here. Gather your things quickly and do not forget to complete every last of your assignments."
The sight of Walter alone was enough to make Tanya sick to her stomach. There was not a single other person on planet Earth who she despised more than him. She turned her face up at him and frowned. "He is not my father." "Ugh," she said.
"The feeling is mutual,"
Walter said in the most nonchalant tone possible.
Hiya, I'm Frankie, Tanya's best friend. I've heard a lot about you, Mr. Walt.
He interrupted. Walter looked at the boy up and down, frowned, then looked away as if he were too good to entertain someone of Frankie's caliber.
"Look, kid, it's Walter. And that's Mr. Braxton to you. Now back up before you step on my shoes,"
he said while gently shoving him away with his fingertips. Tanya's face softened, and she altered her tones. "You know, I actually need some help with my bags, if you don't mind," she said pleasantly. Walter scoffed, then took a look at his Rolex.
"I'll help you, Tanya,"
Frankie blurted. No, I need Walter's help." "Thanks though, buddy." Walter clapped his hands together and rubbed them together furiously.
"Let's get this going. I have things to do,"
he said, giving Father Nicholas a nervous chuckle. Frankie hung his head in sorrow. Tanya embraced him with the biggest hug that she could muster, then took a step back.
"See you around,"
he said softly, still looking at the semi-frozen ground beneath him. Walter shooed Frankie with one hand and pushed Tanya away with the other. Father Nicholas scolded Frankie for not heading to his next period, and both of them made their ways off.
"How far is your room from here? And didn't your mother tell you to have your things ready to go by the time I got here? I don't have time for this. Do I look like a baggage handler to you, kid? If I would have known, I would have asked the driver to come help."
"Not too far," she said in a short, monotone voice. "It's just past there." She pointed, aiming her finger towards the tree line.
"Wait, what? You sure? I don't see a damn thing out there. I can't be walking through all this snow in these shoes,"
he complained, swiping snowflakes off of his expensive suit blazer. "Yep, I left a few things out here during physical ed." He squinted his eyes at her and snatched her by the shoulder.
"What, do you think I'm stupid or something? It's cold as crap out here. And you're telling me that you all came out here during PE? I swear.
Tanya broke free and took off as fast as she could through the snow. The snow almost swallowed her Mary Janes, but she did not care. Snot was beginning to run from her nose, making it hard for her to breathe.
God damn it, Tanya! Get back here! I don't have time for your games!
He screamed from behind her, struggling to keep up. The tree line drew closer and closer in her sights. Again, she stopped right before the trees were at an arm's reach. Walter snatched her from behind and flung her down into the icy snow.
Ugh! I'm gonna kill you, kid!
He screamed while hitting her with a volley of slaps across the head.
I'm here! I came back like I said I would! Take him!
She yelled from under the cover of her forearms. Besides a furious cursing attacking Walter, there was absolute silence. Perhaps it was too late. Maybe her sudden change of mind had angered the things. Maybe she had angered him.
Please! Come on! Have him!
She screamed.
Who the hell are you talking to? Are you trying to get me robbed, you little brat?
Walter lunged for her neck, but halted when they heard rustling within the darkness of the woods. Tanya could see hints of maroon throughout the shadows, and let out a slight smirk. A screech rang out into the air, then others followed as if it were an echo. Walter sat straight and frantically scanned the tree line.
Who's there?
He said. Tanya slowly stood up and brushed crumpled snow from her uniform. She knew what would come next, but she needed to see it. Cloaked figures emerged from the dark. One of the figures let out a sharp, jagged, buttery yellow smile at Walter.
Tanya? What the hell is this?
He moaned, beginning to stagger away. Suddenly, a figure rushed towards him and knocked him over onto his back. More screeches rang out into the cold, crisp air. Tanya observed her surroundings to see if anyone caught wind or could hear the commotion.
Help me!
Walter screamed as they tore his suit to shreds. Tanya's emotions jumped from terrified to pleasure in mere seconds. She slowly backed away with a slight smile on her face, watching every movement, not missing any detail. A horde formed around him, all kneeling above the helpless man while they took what they could. Walter's screams grew louder as they tore at his stomach and pulled at his intestines like rope. The ringleader of the pack grabbed the screaming man by the head and twisted it fully around in one swift motion. No longer could Tanya hear his desperate screams, just the sound of chewing, tearing, and ravenous groans. One of the things was stripping every ounce of meat off of Walter's thigh bone. The ringleader stood up and directed his attention towards Tanya. Her smile quickly faded, realizing that she could very well be next. He gave a bloody grin and placed his long index finger over his thin, greasy lips. She nodded submissively and kept backing up through the snowy field. When the crowd of things was merely a maroon stain against the snow in the distance, she turned around and sprinted as fast as she could back to the girls' dormitory. She grabbed her things from her room and struggled to get them all down the stairs at once. She ran through the open corridor of the campus. Her pace did not slow once, even after she made it to the parking lot and saw the driver waiting there at the entrance. She knocked on the window with her fist full of luggage, and the driver immediately hopped out of the vehicle to assist her. She opened the back door and sunk into the leather seats, feeling relieved to be so close to her clean getaway. The driver closed the trunk and looked around. "Where's Mr. Bra?"
"He's handling business. He said it will take him a while and that we should leave without him."
"But
I am telling you what he said, what I want. We're leaving now,"
Tanya said sternly. The driver and Tanya had a standoff for a few seconds before he finally nodded his head and closed her door. He entered the driver's seat and looked into the rear view. Are you sure he's okay with this? I'm not trying to get fired or anything, ma'am. You work for me now, she said assuringly. The driver shrugged his shoulders and put the car into drive. As they pulled out of the school parking lot, Tanya turned her head away, never wanting to see that place again. She lay down across the back seats and closed her eyes, wanting desperately to sleep. The car came to a halt, and Tanya's eyes finally opened. Back home, ma'am, the driver said. She sat up and leaped from the car, desperate to get inside. The driver began taking her things out of the trunk and placing them on their doorstep. Once he was done, he got back inside of the vehicle and waved goodbye. Tanya gave a small wave back, then went for the door. She ran inside and saw her mother sitting at the dining room table. I'm back, she said cheerfully.
Where's Walter? Still in the car?
Her mother said without looking up. Ironically, she was reading the magazine that Tanya had left in her car the day before.
I forgot how garbage these things were,
she said, tossing the magazine aside. Tanya's smile faded instantly. She hadn't even said hello to her, yet she was already worried about her precious Walter. No, he won't be coming home. He said he's done with us. He won't be coming back, she said flatly.
What do you mean?
Her mother said, placing her hand on her hip with concern. I mean, it's just us now, and it will stay that way forever. There were a few moments of silence. Tanya tried desperately to hide her grin from her clearly upset mother.
Tanya? What did you say to him? What did you do?
Her mother said through her teeth. Nothing, Mother. I didn't do anything at all. You shouldn't be too upset about it, though. We still have all his money. That's what all this was ever about anyways. Money, right? I was never that stupid.
You shut your damn mouth,
her mother said, taking a step closer to her and cocking her hand back. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mother. I'll just stay silent and keep still until you accept things for how they are now. Tanya turned around and slowly walked to her room. She threw herself on her bed and smiled to herself. She felt relieved. She felt accomplished. Her mother was right. Sometimes in life, you have to make choices that other people may not like. But she was very wrong about one thing. It was about what she wanted.
Chilling tales for dark nights.